Hey guys, tonight we are easing into a story from the very, very distant past. You're settling in, maybe the lights are low, the world outside is fading away, and you find yourself drifting back thousands of years to a time when the veil between sleep and wakefulness felt a little thinner, and the things that haunted your dreams felt a whole lot more real. Imagine the crackle of a fire outside a mud brick dwelling, the strange calls of night creatures echoing in the darkness, and you perhaps waking up with a gasp, shaking off the tendrils of something truly unsettling that visited you while you slept. How do you deal with that? How do you bottle up the terror and stop it from coming back the next night? Tonight, we explore an ancient ritual, a rumored practice designed to literally trap those nasty nightmares in little clay dolls. It sounds wild, right? Like something straight out of a dusty, forbidden scroll. And honestly, given how boring I aim for this to be, you probably won't survive this without drifting off. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling up to it, let me know your location and the local time in the comments. It's always cool to see where everyone is tuning in from as they nod off. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story, or rather the whispers of this story, allegedly begins not with a dramatic bang, but with a quiet discovery. Imagine, if you can, peering over the shoulder of an archaeologist, not the Indiana Jones type swinging from ropes, but the patient, dusty kind, meticulously brushing away millennia of accumulated earth from a forgotten corner of the ancient world. Think Mesopotamia, perhaps. Or maybe Egypt, regions where written language first bloomed like strange flowers in the desert heat. You're squinting at cuneiform tablets, those pillow-shaped lumps of clay, etched with wedge-shaped marks. Or perhaps poring over papyrus scrolls, brittle and faded, handled with the utmost care lest they crumble into nothingness. It's in texts like these, we are told, that the first tantalizing hints of this bizarre ritual are supposedly found. Not a grand declaration or a chapter dedicated to dream trapping. Oh no, that would be far too exciting. Instead, the mentions are frustratingly brief, tucked away in the margins of incantations for healing, lists of offerings to unpredictable deities, or even maddeningly administrative records that somehow veer into the esoteric. Picture a scribe thousands of years ago, perhaps feeling a bit sleep-deprived himself after a particularly vivid nightmare involving giant scorpions. Because let's be honest, if you lived back then, giant scorpions were probably high on the list of potential dream antagonists, right up there with forgetting to pay your grain taxes. He's writing down a list of supplies for a temple, cataloging bolts of linen, jars of oil, bushels of barley, and then, almost as an afterthought, he scribbles something that, centuries later, makes a modern scholar sit bolt upright, spilling lukewarm coffee on their desk. Something about small, fired figures, or images of dread-made flesh, or clay holders of knight's teeth. The language is obscure, often metaphorical, as ancient languages are wont to be when dealing with anything remotely mystical or psychological. These brief allusions are like tiny, scattered breadcrumbs, hinting at a practice that was perhaps common enough to be mentioned in passing, but not so universally understood that it needed detailed explanation every time. Or perhaps, and this is where the sleepy ASMR comes in, it was simply too mundane to warrant lengthy description for people who lived it daily. Oh, himbo, next door is making another nightmare doll? Yawn. Anyway, about those grain taxes. The purported discovery isn't a single event, but rather a slow accumulation of these scattered references. Imagine years of painstaking translation, cross-referencing terms, trying to decipher archaic slang for really bad dream or small, potentially haunted mud pie. It's the academic equivalent of trying to assemble a flat-pack furniture kit with no instructions, only cryptic notes scrawled on beverage coasters. Attach thingy to whatchamacallit. Wait, is thingy the nightmare or the clay? You get the idea. And the earliest mentions? They are debated, of course. Some scholars point to a fragment of a Sumerian text, barely preserved, that seems to describe a ritual object buried after a night of terror. Others argue the true origin lies in Old Kingdom Egypt, citing funerary texts that mention protective amulets shaped like human figures, which some interpret as related to warding off bad dreams in the afterlife, or perhaps dealing with them before entering it. There's even fringe speculation about the Indus Valley civilization, based on small, enigmatic terracotta figures found there, though most mainstream archaeologists classify these differently. Historians still argue whether these early mentions truly refer to a dedicated ritual for trapping nightmares in dolls, or if they are simply related to broader concepts of protection, sympathetic magic, or dealing with malevolent spirits, some of whom might visit in sleep. It's the kind of debate that could put you right to sleep, which, ironically, is kind of the point here. The context of these early mentions is crucial. This isn't happening in a vacuum. These are cultures deeply intertwined with the spiritual realm. Dreams weren't just random neurological firings, they were messages from gods, omens of the future, or visitations from spirits, benevolent or otherwise. A good dream might bring blessings. A bad one could signal divine displeasure, an impending disaster, or an attack by a demonic entity. Sleep itself could be a vulnerable state, a temporary death where your soul might wander, encountering dangers. So the idea of actively dealing with a terrifying dream, of externalizing it and neutralizing its threat, wouldn't have seemed strange at all. It was a practical problem requiring a spiritual solution, much like using crocodile dung sunscreen. Yes, that was a real thing in ancient Egypt for skincare. And frankly, it makes dealing with a clay doll sound like a spa treatment. The very first sources that might hint at this ritual are incredibly old, potentially predating much of what we consider classical history. We're talking periods where writing itself was still a relatively new, almost magical technology. Imagine trying to describe a complex psychological event like a nightmare using a limited lexicon and symbols primarily designed for accounting or listing kings. It's like trying to explain quantum physics using only emojis. But the determination to do so, to find a way to understand and control these terrifying nocturnal experiences, speaks volumes about how seriously they took their dreams. The supposed earliest text fragments are notoriously difficult to interpret, often damaged, incomplete, and written in languages that went extinct thousands of years ago, only partially understood by modern scholars. You're relying on the patience and expertise of people who dedicate their lives to figuring out what symbols etched into mud meant to someone living before the pyramids were built. It's a fascinating thought that the history of sleep and sleeplessness due to fear is literally etched in clay from the dawn of civilization. One quirky tidbit related to this period is the ancient Mesopotamian belief in the Zikik, a kind of flying dream spirit or ghost that could enter your room through cracks or keyholes and bring bad dreams or illness. The idea of needing a physical object to contain or ward off such a spirit makes the clay doll ritual seem less arbitrary and more like a logical, albeit unconventional, form of ancient pest control. If your nightmare was caused by a flying spirit, maybe trapping it in a doll was the equivalent of setting a very low-tech spirit trap. It's a little creepy, a little sad, and utterly captivating. And it certainly adds a layer of practical urgency to developing a method to deal with those unwelcome night visitors. So, while we can't point to a single definitive moment, like, on this day, 4,500 years ago, Brenda invented the nightmare doll after a particularly nasty dream about a talking jackal, the narrative pieced together from these ancient scraps suggests a gradual emergence of this idea. It likely evolved over time, perhaps starting as a simpler protective charm and developing into the more structured ritual we'll explore. The precise moment and culture of its true origin remain obscured by the mists of time and the frustrating incompleteness of the historical record. And that, my friends, is how the whispers of trapped nightmares first entered the historical consciousness, or at least the part of it that's just boring enough to lull you to sleep. You were just easing into the idea that those fragmented whispers in ancient texts might point to something real, a way people long ago tried to wrestle control back from the terrifying visions that plagued their sleep. But to really grasp why they might go to the trouble of shaping clay and performing rituals just for a bad dream, you have to understand how they saw the world and especially how they saw the night and how they saw sleep itself. Forget your modern understanding where dreams are just your brain tidying up files or processing the day's worries, or maybe that weird pizza you had. Back then, dreams were serious business. They weren't just in your head, they were from somewhere else, somewhere significant. Imagine yourself in that time, before streetlights pushed back the dark, before alarm clocks regulated your slumber. When the sun set, the world truly changed. The familiar landscape became a place of shadows and unknowns. The creatures of the night emerged, and more importantly, the spirits and deities seemed closer, their influence more potent in the hours of darkness. Sleep wasn't just rest, it was a journey. Your conscious mind shut down, your physical body lay vulnerable, and your soul or some vital part of you was believed to perhaps leave the body, to wander, to meet with divine beings, or tragically, to encounter malevolent forces. It was a state of profound vulnerability, a temporary stepping away from the protection the waking world offered. Think about that feeling when you are just on the edge of sleep, that moment of letting go. They felt that, but amplified by a worldview where spirits literally lurked in the shadows outside your hut, waiting for an opportunity. In Mesopotamia, for instance, dreams could be messages from the gods, instructions, warnings, or prophecies. Bad dreams, particularly recurring or terrifying ones, were often interpreted as omens of misfortune, sickness, or even punishment from deities you might have unknowingly offended. It was like getting a really scary email from a divine spammer. You couldn't just delete it, you had to do something about it. They developed sophisticated systems for dream interpretation. And yes, this is our mainstream historical fact. Ancient Mesopotamians, particularly the Babylonians, had detailed dream books and professional dream interpreters. These were serious advisors, consulted by kings and commoners alike. You wouldn't just wake up from a nightmare about your teeth falling out and shrug it off. You'd potentially seek out a Baru priest, a diviner skilled in reading signs, including those in your sleep, to figure out what divine message or warning you just received. This wasn't just folklore. It was a recognized part of their intellectual and religious landscape. The vulnerability during sleep wasn't just theoretical. They believed specific demons and spirits were particularly active at night. One example, and here's a quirky or fringe tidbit that adds to the creepiness factor, is the Mesopotamian demon Lilith, who was said to prey on men in their sleep and harm infants. While the Lilith myth evolved over time and across cultures, early beliefs about such nocturnal entities highlight the very real fear that sleep left you open to spiritual attack. It wasn't just a bad dream, it might be a malevolent force actively trying to harm you while you were helpless. Imagine trying to sleep knowing that invisible, potentially child-snatching demons might be lurking just outside your flimsy reed mat door. Suddenly, that lumpy clay figure you made doesn't seem quite so strange, does it? It's a physical countermeasure against a spiritual threat. In ancient Egypt, the situation was similar, though perhaps with slightly different nuances. Sleep was sometimes likened to a temporary death, a journey to the duat, the underworld, before returning to the land of the living upon waking. Dreams were seen as significant, sometimes as communications from the gods, sometimes as symbolic visions needing interpretation. Dream interpretation was also a recognized profession there, with papyri existing that listed dreams and their corresponding good or bad omens. Having a disturbing dream wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It could be a sign that your Ka, your life force or spiritual double, or your Ba, your personality soul, encountered danger during its nocturnal travels. Protection wasn't just about your physical body, it was about safeguarding your soul during its most vulnerable state. They wore amulets, recited spells, and performed rituals to ensure safe passage through the night and safe return in the morning. The need for protection wasn't limited to just warding off bad dreams. If dreams were portals or meeting places, you needed protection from everything that might use that portal. Spirits of the dead, mischievous minor deities, purely malevolent forces. The night was a busy, potentially dangerous time on the spiritual plane. And since you were essentially offline, unable to defend yourself physically, you needed passive or ritualistic protection. Think of it like ancient antivirus software for your soul, running silently while you were asleep. This brings us back to the potential origins of our nightmare dolls. If a terrifying dream was caused by a spirit or a specific negative influence, simply interpreting it might not be enough. Interpretation tells you why it happened or what it means, but it doesn't necessarily prevent it from happening. Again, you needed a way to neutralize the source, to capture it, to banish it, or perhaps to trick it. This is where the idea of sympathetic magic likely comes into play. The belief that you can influence something through a representation of it. If the nightmare is a visitation from a specific entity or the embodiment of a specific fear, perhaps creating a physical object to represent that nightmare or that entity allows you to manipulate it, contain it, or destroy it. Historians still argue whether the concept of dreaming in these ancient texts aligns perfectly with our modern psychological understanding, or if it primarily referred to visions, trances, or encounters with external entities experienced during sleep. Was a nightmare seen as an internal psychological disturbance or an external spiritual attack? The truth is likely a blend, but the response was often framed in spiritual or magical terms regardless. The fragmented texts make it hard to definitively separate psychological distress from perceived external demonic influence. It's like trying to understand ancient medicine. Was that fever a biological issue or the result of an angry god? Often the answer was both, and the treatment involved herbs and prayers. So you find yourself in a world where sleep is risky, the darkness outside is filled with unseen threats, and the darkness inside your closed eyelids might be even more perilous. A gateway for those threats to reach your very essence. You need protection. You need a way to deal with the terrifying visions that shatter your rest. Not just understand them, but contain them. This deep-seated need for spiritual security during sleep, combined with the belief in the power of representation and ritual, created fertile ground for practices like our rumored nightmare trapping. It was a practical solution born out of a very serious, deeply held belief about the nature of reality, the vulnerability of the human soul, and the dangers lurking in the night. And that, my friends, is a much more compelling reason to get out your clay than simply wanting to make a decorative pot. No offense to ancient potters, of course. Their work is lovely, but it probably didn't protect them from being visited by a zakik. The sense of being exposed and helpless in the dark is a universal fear, but ancient cultures codified it, gave it names and forms. They built intricate systems of belief and practice around mitigating that fear. The clay doll ritual, if it existed as described, would have been just one piece of this larger puzzle of nocturnal defense. It wasn't just about feeling better after a bad dream. It was potentially about preventing illness, misfortune, or even death believed to be caused by those dreams or the entities behind them. It's a peek into a mindset where the line between the physical and the spiritual was incredibly thin, and where every aspect of life, even the involuntary act of dreaming, was imbued with potentially world-altering significance. And that significance drove them to desperate, creative, and frankly, fascinating measures, like making little clay prisons for your scary thoughts. So you've spent the last little while wading through the terrifying possibility that ancient people didn't just have bad dreams. They believed their souls were literally getting mugged in the spiritual alleyways of the night. They needed protection, something tangible to push back against the intangible horrors. And what material was more readily available, more infinitely shapeable, and more deeply embedded in human history than clay? Seriously, think about it. Before metal was common, before sophisticated tools were everywhere, there was dirt. Specifically, that wonderful, slightly sticky dirt you could mix with water and make, well, pretty much anything. Mud pies, obviously, but also much, much more. Clay is one of the earliest materials humans manipulated extensively. Its sheer availability meant that almost every culture, from the Fertile Crescent to the river valleys of China, the jungles of Mesoamerica, to the shores of the Mediterranean, had access to it. And its malleability meant you could take this formless mud and give it shape, intent, and meaning. You could pinch it, roll it, mold it, carve into it, and then Depending on whether you left it in the sun or stuck it in a fire, you could make that shape permanent. This wasn't just useful for pots to store your ancient grains or bricks to build your drafty, yet sturdy, hut. It was perfect for symbolism, for representation, for giving physical form to ideas, beliefs, and entities that didn't otherwise exist in the physical world. Think about early myths. In several ancient creation stories, humans themselves are formed from clay or mud. The Mesopotamians, for example, had tales where the gods mingled their blood with clay to create humankind. The ancient Egyptians believed the ram-headed god Khnum molded people on his potter's wheel. Even in the biblical narrative, Adam is formed from the dust of the ground. This isn't just a coincidence. It highlights a fundamental ancient understanding of clay as the very stuff of creation, the raw material from which life and form could emerge. If gods could make people from clay, maybe you could make other things from clay too? Things with power, things with purpose. Beyond creation myths, clay was used extensively for communication and record keeping. This is our mainstream historical fact for this section. The invention of writing, particularly cuneiform in Mesopotamia, was intrinsically linked to clay. Scribes would press wedge-shaped marks into soft clay tablets, which would then be dried or fired, creating permanent records of laws, transactions, literature, and yes, even spells and rituals. You can hold a 4,000-year-old clay tablet in a museum today and read the thoughts of someone long gone. It's the ultimate historical hard drive, though significantly heavier and less portable than your phone. Imagine dropping one of those. Instant floor renovation. This widespread use of clay for writing demonstrates a key property: its ability to hold information and intent, to fix something ephemeral, words, ideas, into a durable form. This idea of fixing or containing information or intent in clay becomes important when we think about trapping something like a nightmare. But what about representation? Clay figures appear in archaeological sites dating back millennia, long before widespread writing. Tiny figurines of animals, women, or ambiguous shapes. What were they for? This brings us to an area where historians still argue whether these early clay figures were primarily toys, religious icons, votive offerings, or objects used in magic. The truth is, they were probably all of the above, depending on the context. A small animal figure could be a child's toy one day and placed in a grave as an offering the next. A female figurine could represent a fertility goddess or be used in a personal magical ritual. The point is, humans instinctively use clay to make miniature versions of things, and these miniature versions often carried significant symbolic weight. Now let's veer into a slightly quirkier or fringe tidbit that shows how clay was used for purposes beyond the obvious. In some ancient cultures, there's evidence of clay being used not just to represent people or gods, but specifically for curses or binding spells. You might find clay figurines with their limbs broken, stuck with pins, or bound with cords, sometimes inscribed with the name of an enemy. These curse figures or binding figures were created with the explicit intention of causing harm or restricting the actions of the person they represented. It's sympathetic magic at work, manipulating the representation to influence the reality. While not directly related to dreams, it shows a belief that you could mold clay to embody an enemy or a problem, and then use that physical object as a focal point for magical action against the target. If you could make a clay figure to mess up your neighbor's day, could you make one to mess up a nightmare's night? It's not such a huge leap in the magical mindset. Clay also embodies the idea of transformation. You start with wet earth, yielding, formless. You shape it, and it dries, becoming firm. Fire it, and it becomes hard, permanent, fundamentally changed into ceramic. This transformation from shaped into hard, from temporary to durable, could also hold symbolic meaning. You take a problem, something fluid and frightening like a nightmare, give it a defined form in soft clay, and then through a process, drying, perhaps a simple firing, or ritual action, you make that containment permanent. You harden the trap. You fix the nightmare in place so it can't roam free. Consider the use of clay seals. They weren't just practical ways to secure a jar or a door. The impression left in the clay could act as a signature, a mark of ownership, or even a form of protection. A broken seal indicated trespass. The clay barrier, marked with authority, was intended to contain or exclude. This simple function of containment and exclusion, made visible and official through clay, might also have informed how people thought about using clay against unseen forces. You create a clay barrier, you impress it with ritual intent, and it contains the unwanted entity, keeping it out of your sleep space. The very act of working with clay is tactile, grounding. You take the earth in your hands, feel its coolness and plasticity. There's a direct connection to the physical world, to the source material of life and structure. In a time when the line between the physical and spiritual was blurry, working with such a fundamental material might have felt like directly interacting with the building blocks of existence, giving you a degree of control you didn't have over, say, the weather or the whims of the gods. So, long before anyone supposedly thought about sculpting a bad dream into a little mud doll, clay was already imbued with deep symbolic meaning. It was the stuff of creation, a medium for communication and permanence, a tool for representation, a canvas for magic, both benevolent and malevolent, and a material embodying transformation and containment. It was cheap, abundant, and responsive to human hands and intention. It was, in short, the perfect material for taking something terrifyingly formless, like a nightmare entity slipping into your vulnerable sleeping mind and giving it a concrete, controllable, containable form. Think about the effort involved. Finding the right clay, processing it, perhaps mixing it with straw or sand for strength, then the painstaking work of shaping it. This wasn't just a casual activity, it was an investment of time and physical effort, which in ancient ritual often signified seriousness and commitment. You weren't just thinking about your problem, you were physically molding its solution, literally getting your hands dirty in the process. It's a stark contrast to how we might deal with anxiety today. Maybe we journal, meditate, or just doom scroll until 3 a.m. Definitely not recommending that last one. They might have been kneading clay. The widespread use of clay for effigies, seals, tablets bearing spells, and figures in rituals across vastly different cultures points to a shared human understanding of its potential for symbolic and practical magic. It wasn't just about making pretty things. It was about interacting with the world, seen and unseen, through a material that felt fundamental and powerful. It was about taking control where control felt scarce. And if you felt utterly powerless against the terrifying visitors that haunted your sleep, what could be more natural than to reach for the earth itself, the material of creation and containment, and try to mold your safety? The fragmented whispers about nightmare dolls suggest a specific application of these ancient understandings of clay. They didn't invent the idea of using clay for ritual or representation out of nowhere. They were building upon a deep, existing cultural relationship with this material, a relationship where clay was already a potent symbol of form-giving, preservation, and containment. They were adapting ancient techniques and beliefs about clay's power to address a specific, deeply personal, and terrifying problem: the nightmare. And that adaptation, that leap from general clay magic to specific dream trapping, is where things get really interesting. But to understand it, you first had to appreciate just how much ancient hands trusted and utilized this humble, incredible earth beneath their feet. You've got this mental image now, right? Of ancient hands covered in the cool, damp earth, coaxing form out of formlessness. You understand that clay wasn't just dirt, it was pregnant with possibility, a material deeply connected to creation myths, used for everything from writing down the price of barley to binding an enemy in sympathetic magic. But when did humans start making little people out of it? Not just pots or bricks, but figures, representations of living things. This is where we venture even further back, peeling back the layers of time to find the very first whispers of humanity giving their world miniature form. We're talking way, way back. So far back, in fact, that written records are non-existent. We're deep in prehistory, relying solely on what archaeology unearths. And what archaeology has unearthed, scattered across Ice Age Europe and parts of Asia, are small, often palm-sized figures made of various materials: stone, Ivory, bone, and yes, sometimes early forms of fired clay or baked loess, a type of fine silt. These are some of the oldest pieces of figurative art we have, dating back maybe 25,000, 30,000, even up to 40,000 years ago. Think about that for a second. Your ancestors were shaping little figures before they were building cities, before they were farming, while woolly mammoths still roamed the landscape. It's mind-boggling. These figures are often referred to broadly as Paleolithic figurines. The most famous ones you might have heard of are the so-called Venus figurines, multiple, often corpulent female figures with exaggerated features like breasts and hips. The Venus of Willendorf is perhaps the poster child, though she's made of limestone. But there are others made of different materials. And our mainstream historical fact for this section is this. The earliest known fired clay object is a figure, specifically the Venus of Dolní Věstonice, discovered in the Czech Republic and dated to somewhere around 25,000 to 30,000 years ago. Yes, you read that right. The oldest known ceramic wasn't a potsherd, but a little humanish figure. They weren't just trying to cook stuff, they were making art, symbols, maybe even magic, out of fired mud, tens of thousands of years ago. This isn't some fringe theory, it's a foundational piece of archaeological knowledge. But these aren't just female figures. Archaeological sites have yielded figures of animals, bison, horses, lions, mammoths, as well as more abstract or ambiguous shapes. Some seem carefully carved or molded. Others are quite crude, maybe just a few pinches and rolls of clay. They range in size, but many are small enough to hold in your hand, to carry in a pouch. Imagine tucking something like that into your rough animal skin garment as you headed out into the freezing world. What kind of comfort or power would it offer? The sites where these very early clay figures have been found are scattered across a vast geographic area, from caves in France and Germany to open-air sites in Eastern Europe and Russia. The context of their discovery varies. Sometimes they're found in living areas, near hearths. Sometimes they're found in what seem like ritual spaces. Sometimes they're found broken into pieces, scattered deliberately. And this brings us squarely to the heart of the mystery, the fascinating point of archaeological head-scratching. What were these figures for? This is an area where historians still argue whether these figures were primarily religious icons, fertility symbols, teaching tools, representations in sympathetic magic, personal amulets for protection or luck, or simply the earliest expressions of art for art's sake. It's incredibly difficult to know for sure, tens of thousands of years later, with no written context. We are looking at mute objects and trying to infer the complex beliefs and practices of people utterly alien to us. Let's unpack some of those theories, shall we? The fertility symbol theory is popular, especially for the Venus figures. Their exaggerated features certainly suggest a focus on reproduction, vital for the survival of small, precarious groups. Maybe they were used in rituals to ensure successful births, or to represent the life-giving power of a mother goddess. It's a compelling idea rooted in the fundamental human need to reproduce. Another theory posits they were religious icons of some kind. Perhaps they represented deities or spirits relevant to hunter-gatherer life. Spirits of animals, spirits of the land, spirits associated with birth or death. Holding one might have been a way to connect with the divine or seek supernatural aid. Then there's the idea of sympathetic magic. We touched on this with the later curse figures, but the principle is ancient. You make a representation of something you want to influence, and by acting on the figure, you influence the real thing. Could the animal figures have been used in hunting magic, perhaps to ensure a successful hunt or to magically injure prey? Could the human figures be representations of individuals for healing spells? Or yes, perhaps even protection from unseen dangers? This idea certainly edges us closer to the realm of using figures for personal, practical, magical purposes, which feels relevant to our quest for nightmare dolls. Some scholars suggest they were teaching tools. Maybe the animal figures were used to teach children about different species and their anatomy. Maybe the human figures were used to explain kinship relationships or social roles. It's a more pragmatic interpretation, Certainly less dramatic than magic or religion, but plausible. Or maybe they were just art, expressions of creativity, attempts to capture the beauty or significance of the world around them. Even early humans appreciated aesthetics, right? Who's to say they didn't just feel the urge to sculpt a tiny mammoth because, well, mammoths are cool, though risking frostbite just to make a fridge magnet feels unlikely. Here's a slightly quirkier tidbit that feeds into the debate. Some of these very early figures show signs of deliberate damage. Limbs broken off, marks that could be interpreted as wounds. If they were just art or teaching tools, why break them? This damage has led some researchers to suggest they were used in rituals where they were intentionally modified or destroyed as part of the ceremony. Maybe mimicking a hunt, maybe symbolizing death or transformation. Or perhaps they were being used to contain or defeat something negative like a curse or, well, you see where this is going. The purposeful destruction of a figure hints strongly at a magical or ritual function, not just passive representation. Think about the labor involved again. Finding the clay, maybe processing it, shaping it with rudimentary tools or just fingers. And then, in the case of the Dolny Vestonis figure, finding a way to fire it. Firing clay at temperatures high enough to make it ceramic requires understanding fire control, building a kiln, or using a hot hearth strategically. This wasn't an everyday casual activity like picking berries. Making one of these figures, especially a fired one, was an investment of time, skill, and precious resources, fuel for the fire. Objects that require significant effort in prehistoric societies were rarely made without significant purpose. So while archaeologists debate the exact meaning of every bulge and pinch on these ancient forms, the fact remains, humans were using clay and similar materials to create miniature representations of their world, including themselves and the animals around them, from astonishingly early times. And there's strong evidence, particularly the deliberate damage and contextual findings, suggesting that many of these figures were not just passive objects to look at, but active participants in the spiritual, social, or magical life of these communities. They were giving tangible form to the things that mattered to them: fertility, animals, maybe even abstract concepts or unseen forces. They were using these figures, interacting with them, perhaps using them as focal points for their hopes, fears, or intentions. Now link this back to our potential nightmare dolls. If humans were already using small figures made of earth to connect with the spiritual realm, to influence events through sympathetic magic, or to represent powerful forces like fertility or animal spirits, is it such a huge leap to think they might also use them to represent a terrifying, unwanted spiritual intrusion like a nightmare? If you can make a figure to bring you luck in a hunt, could you make one to trap the snarling spirit that haunts your sleep? The tradition of making figures from clay for ritual or symbolic purposes is ancient and widespread. The earliest examples show a deep-seated human drive to create representations and invest them with meaning and power. They demonstrate that clay, in the hands of our ancestors, was a material ripe for embodying the unseen, for focusing intent, for interacting with a reality that extended beyond the purely physical. We might not find a nightmare doll specifically labeled as such in a 30,000-year-old dig site. The purpose of these early figures is complex and multifaceted, likely varying from figure to figure, site to site, and indeed depending on who you ask among the experts. But the archaeological record clearly shows that the building blocks for such a practice were firmly in place. The understanding of clay as a medium for representation and ritual, the creation of small, potent figures, the use of these figures in active magical or spiritual contexts, it was all there in the hands of people navigating a world filled with both visible dangers and invisible forces they desperately sought to understand and control. They were laying the cultural and practical groundwork, thousands upon thousands of years ago, for the later, more specific magical practices we might encounter on our journey. They showed that, yes, you could make things out of earth, things that mattered, things that did something, at least in the eyes of the maker. So you've got these incredibly ancient whispers from prehistory, this faint echo of humans molding earth into shapes that held meaning, perhaps power, maybe even a way to grapple with the unseen. You picture those small, rough forms, potentially used in rituals under vast, star-filled, icy skies, thousands upon thousands of years ago. Now, fast forward. Fast forward. Skip over millennia, over the slow but relentless creep of agriculture, the domestication of animals, the first tentative steps towards settled life. We're jumping across a chasm of time into a world that looks very different. A world where people are building cities, writing things down, organizing themselves into complex societies with kings, priests, and armies. Our focus shifts now to two cradles of civilization, places where the use of clay figures didn't disappear into the mists of prehistory, but instead evolved, becoming integrated into sophisticated religious, magical, and administrative systems. We're talking about ancient Egypt, nestled along the fertile ribbon of the Nile, and Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Here, the tradition of shaping Earth wasn't lost. It just got more complicated, more specialized, more bureaucratic in a way. In Egypt, for instance, figures made of clay, stone, wood, or most famously, a glassy ceramic material called faience became incredibly common, especially in funerary contexts. You've probably seen them, these small, mummy-shaped figures, often covered in hieroglyphs. These are ushabti, sometimes spelled shawabti or shabti, and our mainstream historical fact for this section is that ushabti were figures placed in tombs with the specific purpose of acting as substitutes for the deceased in the afterlife. The ancient Egyptians believed that in the field of reeds, their paradise, they might be called upon by the gods to perform manual labor, farming, digging canals, that kind of thing. Sounds exhausting, even in paradise, right? So the ushabti figures were essentially magical stand-ins, animated by spells inscribed on them, ready to leap into action whenever the call for work came. You buried enough ushabti, and you could theoretically kick back and relax forever. It was basically outsourcing your afterlife chores. If only my laundry basket came with a magical helper figure. These ushabti were often made in large numbers. Some wealthy tombs contained hundreds, even thousands of them. While the later, more famous ones are often faience, earlier ushabti were commonly made of clay, sometimes unfired or just sun-dried. They show this direct continuity from the prehistoric use of earth figures, but with a much more defined, specialized purpose within a complex religious framework. They weren't vague fertility symbols. They were very specific, magical servant figures intended to literally do work in another dimension. They represent a profound belief that a crafted figure could embody a function, could be imbued with life or purpose through ritual and inscription, and could operate on a spiritual plane. The Egyptians also used figures in other ways that hint at the power attributed to sculpted forms. They would place small figures, sometimes of deities or animals, as part of foundation deposits, intentional burials of objects placed under the corners or entrances of buildings like temples or tombs. These deposits were symbolic acts meant to consecrate the structure, protect it, and link it to the divine order. The figures in this context weren't just offerings, they were active components in the building's spiritual integrity. Silent guardians embedded within the earth it rested upon. Now let's hop over to Mesopotamia. Here, the relationship between humans and the unseen world of spirits, demons, and gods felt perhaps even more immediate and, frankly, more precarious than in Egypt. Mesopotamian religion and magic were deeply intertwined, and the world was seen as teeming with potential dangers. Demons causing illness, bad luck, or just general misery. This led to a rich tradition of apotropaic magic, rituals and objects designed specifically to ward off evil. And guess what played a huge role in this apotropaic magic? Figures made of clay. Lots of them, often buried under thresholds, within walls, or placed in specific corners of houses and temples. These weren't just decorative items, they were active magical defenses. You wanted to stop a particular demon from entering your house? You might bury a clay figure representing a benevolent protective spirit or a demon vanquishing moss under the front door. You were essentially installing a magical security system, hiring tiny clay bouncers to keep the bad vibes out. The variety of these apotropaic figures is fascinating. They could be fierce protective demons themselves, like the benevolent Lamassu or various lion-headed figures, or representations of powerful gods. Sometimes they came in sets, a whole patrol of figures buried together to create a complete magical barrier. Imagine digging under your floorboards and finding a little clay patrol of grumpy-looking mythological creatures. Talk about home security with character. This use of figures for protection feels immediately relevant to our nightmare quest, doesn't it? If you can make a clay figure to ward off a demon causing fever or misfortune, couldn't you adapt that idea to ward off a demon or spirit causing terrifying dreams? The principle of using a crafted form to interact with, repel, or control an unseen entity is clearly established here. But the Mesopotamians also took this further into realms less benevolent. They had a well-developed tradition of using figures in curses and binding spells. Our quirky or fringe tidbit for this section is the existence of Mesopotamian curse figures. These figures, often made of clay or wax, were crafted to represent a specific enemy or rival. The practitioner might write the target's name on the figure, bind it, pierce it, or burn it, believing that whatever was done to the figure would happen to the person it represented. This is sympathetic magic taken to a potentially dark extreme, a direct precursor to later voodoo doll practices. These weren't for protecting against evil, they were for inflicting harm or control using a figure as a proxy. They demonstrate the understanding that a figure could be linked to an individual or entity and used as a focal point for harmful intent or coercive magic. So in Mesopotamia, clay figures serve both ends of the spectrum, protecting you from malevolent forces, apotropaic, and being used as a tool to be a malevolent force against others, curse figures. This duality highlights the perceived power and versatility of these crafted forms. They weren't inert objects, they were vessels for magical action, tools in a constant spiritual battle. And this brings us back to the ongoing questions that keep archaeologists and historians busy. For instance, historians still argue whether the various categories of Mesopotamian figures, those found in temples, those in houses, those clearly used in curses, represent distinct magical traditions, or if there was a fluid exchange of ideas and practices between these different contexts. Were the figures meant to be the spirit or just represent it? Was their power inherent in the clay and form, or purely in the ritual performed upon them? These are tricky questions to answer when your primary sources are buried objects and sometimes cryptic texts written on other pieces of clay. Cuneiform tablets, anyone? The contrast between Egyptian ushabti and Mesopotamian apotropaic curse figures is telling. The Egyptians used figures primarily to ensure things went smoothly for them in the afterlife, a kind of proactive self-help through magic. The Mesopotamians seemed more preoccupied with immediate defense against a world they saw as full of hostile spirits and using figures as weapons or shields in that struggle. Both cultures, however, shared a fundamental belief that a figure crafted from humble materials like clay could be infused with purpose, power, and a connection to the spiritual or magical realm. Think about the transition here. From the possibly multi-purpose, enigmatic figures of prehistory, we move to civilizations where figures made of earth have highly defined roles, working for you after death, protecting your home from demons, or even harming your enemies. The craft of figure making becomes embedded in priesthoods, magical texts, and architectural practices. It's no longer just an isolated act. It's part of the fabric of society's attempts to understand and manipulate the forces around them. The Mesopotamians, with their intense focus on warding off demons and their willingness to use figures in aggressive magic, seem particularly close to the concept of dealing with negative entities like nightmares. If a specific demon caused a specific illness, you made a figure to repel that demon. If a specific spirit haunted your sleep with terror, wouldn't the logic extend? Create a figure, link it to the nightmare entity, and then perform an action on the figure to neutralize, trap, or banish that entity. It's not a massive leap from bearing a figure to stop a plague demon entering your door to crafting one to stop a terror demon entering your dreams. So as we trace the path of these clay figures, We see them transform from possibly symbolic or broadly magical objects in deep time to highly specific, functional tools in the complex magical systems of early civilizations. They are used for work, for protection, and for harm. They demonstrate a growing sophistication in the belief that sculpted earth can be a conduit for power, a physical anchor for dealing with non-physical problems. They lay the groundwork for the idea that you don't just endure a spiritual intrusion, you actively do something about it. And often, that something involves making a little person or demon or god out of mud. The tradition is getting richer, more varied, and perhaps, just perhaps, closer to the specific, peculiar ritual we're trying to uncover. The stage is set in these ancient lands for figures to become active agents in the battle against the unseen, preparing the way for them to potentially confront the very real terror of the dreaming mind. You've lingered in the sun-drenched lands along the Nile, where figures stood ready for afterlife work, and in the dustier, demon-haunted plains of Mesopotamia, where sculpted earth guarded homes or targeted enemies. You've seen how the fundamental idea, making a shape, giving it purpose, persisted and evolved, becoming more specialized, more integrated into complex religious and magical systems. Now picture the shift. Trade routes stretching out, ships plying the waters of the Mediterranean, ideas and practices traveling alongside pottery, grain, and textiles. The cultural currents flow from the older civilizations of the Near East westward, carrying whispers of their magic, their gods, and their ways of interacting with the unseen world, including the power held within a crafted form. We're now stepping into the vibrant, often chaotic world of classical antiquity, the world of ancient Greece and Rome. These civilizations were sponges for cultural exchange. They absorbed, adapted, and often rebranded practices and beliefs from the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, and countless other cultures they encountered through conquest, trade, or simple proximity. Magic was no exception. The Greeks, and later the Romans who inherited and built upon Greek culture, developed their own rich traditions of magic, which often incorporated elements borrowed from elsewhere, including the strategic use of figures. Think about their cities, bustling agorae and forums, grand temples to Olympian gods, but also quiet corners where different kinds of rituals took place. While public religion involved sacrifices and prayers to official deities in impressive temples, private magic was widespread and varied, practiced by individuals seeking practical results, finding a lover, ensuring business success, winning a race, or importantly for our story, dealing with enemies or unwanted influences. This is where figures, particularly those linked to what we might broadly call binding or cursing magic, come into play. The Greeks and Romans used figures in various ways, from simple terracotta votives offered at shrines, again, an echo of older practices, but more standardized and religious, to figures used in more complex, often clandestine rituals. But the area where figures became particularly potent, and frankly a little spooky, was in the realm of katadesmoi in Greek or defictionis in Latin. You probably know them as curse tablets. Now, the mainstream historical fact I want you to hold on to here is that defictionis, lead tablets inscribed with curses, often rolled up or folded and deposited in places associated with the underworld or the dead, like tombs, wells, or springs, were incredibly common in the Greek and Roman world. Thousands have been found across the Mediterranean, covering everything from sports rivalries and legal disputes to love affairs and theft. They were essentially magical petitions or commands directed towards chthonic deities, underworld gods, or restless spirits to influence or harm a specific target. While the focus of a defixio was the inscribed text, figures often played a supporting, sometimes central role. The tablet itself might be folded or pierced in ways that mimicked binding or harming a person. And sometimes small figures were buried with the tablets, or the tablets explicitly referred to actions taken on figures. These figures, often crudely made of lead, wax, or clay, were intended to represent the target of the curse. Imagine you're in Roman Britain, say Bath, famous for its thermal springs dedicated to the goddess Sulis Minerva. You've been wronged. Maybe someone stole your cloak. You go to a scribe or a local magic practitioner. They prepare a small lead sheet. You dictate your curse. May the thief who stole my cloak from the bath suffer fever and blindness until they return it. This is inscribed perhaps backward or with magical symbols to enhance its power. Then you might fold it, hammer nails through it, and drop it into the sacred spring, hoping the goddess or the spirits of the waters will enact your curse. That's a standard defixio. But what if you wanted more direct control, more intense binding? This is where figures became more prominent. A curse might involve molding a small figure out of wax or lead, representing the intended victim. Then you would bind the figure with cords, symbolizing the binding of the person's limbs, tongue, or will. You might pierce it with needles, directing harm to specific body parts. The defixio text might even describe these actions. I bind X, his feet, his hands, his mind, his tongue, just as this figure is bound and pierced. The figure wasn't just a placeholder, it was a physical double, a sympathetic link to the target, allowing the practitioner to inflict harm or control from a distance. This is sympathetic magic again, but highly formalized and often quite aggressive. The figures used in these binding spells were often depicted in unnatural or distressed poses, bound, twisted, with arms tied behind their backs. Sometimes they were depicted with exaggerated features or alongside images of demons or underworld deities like Hecate or Hermes Psychopomp, further emphasizing the connection to the liminal and dangerous realms. You were essentially creating a doll to torture or imprison your enemy, using the principle that action on the representation affects the represented. It's the direct ancestor of later voodoo doll concepts, but with deep roots in this classical magical practice. The targets weren't always enemies in a dramatic sense. Many binding spells focused on competitors. A charioteer might commission a defixio infamum with a figure to bind the legs of rival horses or the skill of rival drivers. A lawyer might seek to bind the tongue of an opponent in court. A lover might try to bind the affections of an unwilling object of desire, sometimes with terrifyingly coercive intent. The figures here weren't benevolent protectors like some Mesopotamian ones. They were instruments of coercion, control, or destruction. The transition from the Near Eastern use of figures feels sharper here. While Mesopotamians used figures for both protection and harm, the Greek and Roman emphasis, particularly in the context of defixiones, leans heavily towards the latter, binding, cursing, controlling, inflicting suffering. It shows how the basic technology of making a shape and giving it power could be applied to darker purposes. It's a stark reminder that tools are often neutral. Their application depends on the wielder's intent. A hammer can build a house or smash a window. Clay figures could guard a home or bind an enemy. Let's dig into a quirky or fringe tidbit related to these figures. Sometimes the binding figures weren't just generic representations. In some cases, particularly with wax figures, they might incorporate elements taken directly from the victim. Perhaps a strand of hair, a piece of clothing, or even grave dirt. This was believed to strengthen the sympathetic link between the figure and the target, making the spell more potent. Imagine a magic practitioner meticulously working a strand of hair into a small wax figure, whispering incantations over it in a dimly lit room, preparing to bind the figure with thin lead strips inscribed with names and curses. It adds a layer of almost horrifying intimacy to the practice, making the abstract concept of sympathetic magic very visceral. And of course, like so many aspects of ancient magic, historians still argue whether the figures buried with defixiones were considered essential to the spell's efficacy, or if they were primarily symbolic additions meant to visually reinforce the intention expressed in the text. Were they seen as literally embodying the victim, or were they more like powerful illustrations accompanying the written command? The answer is probably complex, varying depending on the specific tradition, the practitioner, and the beliefs of the time and place. Some scholars argue that the act of crafting and manipulating the figure was the core magical act, with the text being a formal dedication or instruction, while others see the text as primary, with the figure being an important but secondary element. The ambiguity reflects the difficulty in fully understanding the mindset and practical application of ancient magic from material remains alone. Another angle to consider is the legal and social perception of this magic. While private magic was practiced by many, Certain types of magic, especially those involving figures and curses aimed at causing harm or death, were often viewed with suspicion and could be prosecuted. The 12 Tables of Roman law, some of their earliest codified laws, mention prohibitions against magically bewitching crops. Later, Roman law had provisions against harmful magic, maleficium, and using figures as part of curses certainly fell into this category. This tells you how seriously these practices were taken, not just by those who commissioned them, but by society at large, which recognized their perceived potential for harm. Think about the materials used. Lead was common for tablets because it's soft, easy to inscribe, and associated with the underworld, its dark color and weight. Wax was used for figures because it's malleable and can be melted or pierced, symbolizing destruction or weakening. Clay, our recurring star, also appears, sometimes sun-dried or lightly baked, offering a durable but still earth-connected medium. The choice of material was often deliberate, tied to the magical intent and the entities being invoked. So in the classical world, we see the tradition of figure-making for magical purposes continuing, but often twisted towards themes of control and aggression. This focus on binding and harming through a figure, it's highly relevant to our quest for a nightmare-trapping ritual. If you can make a figure to bind an enemy's actions, perhaps you can make a figure to bind a spirit causing nightmares. If you can pierce a wax doll to inflict pain on a rival, maybe you can perform an action on a clay figure to neutralize the power of a terrifying dream entity. The classical period, with its widespread practice of using figures and binding curses, provides a powerful link in the chain, showing the adaptability of this ancient practice to dealing with specific, unwanted influences, albeit usually human ones. The Greeks and Romans weren't necessarily focused specifically on nightmares with these depictions, but their fundamental magical principles, creating a physical representation, linking it sympathetically to an entity, even an abstract one like a nightmare spirit, and then performing actions on the figure to affect that entity, are precisely the kind of principles that could underpin a ritual designed to capture or repel something as elusive as a bad dream. They solidify the idea that a figure can be a magical tool, a point of interaction between the physical world and the unseen forces that trouble human life. From the protective figures guarding a Mesopotamian door to the bound figures in a Roman grave, the belief persists. You can shape the earth, and in doing so you can shape your reality, or at least your interaction with the forces that challenge it. And sometimes that involves making a little doll that looks suspiciously like someone you dislike. Or maybe, just maybe, something that represents the terrifying thing that visits you when you sleep. You've seen how this practice of crafting figures for magical purposes, starting maybe with simple earth effigies guarding homes in distant antiquity, evolved into sophisticated tools for binding and cursing in the classical world of Greece and Rome. The Mediterranean Sea wasn't just a body of water, it was a highway for ideas, goods, and yes, magical practices. But the world didn't stop at the edges of the Roman Empire. Trade routes stretched far beyond, connecting the classical world to the east, across the Byzantine lands, into Persia, along the vast network we now call the Silk Road, and into the diverse cultures of early medieval Eurasia. This was a time of immense change. Empires rose and fell, new religions like Christianity and later Islam spread across vast territories, and peoples migrated, carrying their beliefs and customs with them. And as cultures mixed, so too did their magical traditions. The idea of creating a physical representation of a person or spirit to influence them didn't disappear. It traveled, adapted, and blended with local beliefs and practices. Think about the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern successor to Rome. It maintained many classical traditions, including aspects of Greek language, philosophy, and yes, magic. We still find evidence of practices resembling depicciones and the use of figures in magical rituals in Byzantine papyri and archaeological finds. The figures might now be invoked with Christian saints alongside older gods, or target new kinds of rivals. But the core principle, make a shape, give it power, use it to act on a target, persisted. This is a mainstream historical fact. Magical practices, including figure use, continued and adapted in the Byzantine Empire, often blending Christian elements with classical traditions. As you move further east into Persia under the Sasanian Empire and later under Islamic rule, you see a complex tapestry of indigenous beliefs, Zoroastrianism, Hellenistic influences from Alexander's conquests, and eventually Islam. Magical practices here also incorporated figures, though often described in texts as images or effigies rather than explicitly dolls in the way we might think of them today. These could be used in rituals for healing, protection, or, as in the classical world, for cursing or influencing others. Imagine a traveler on the Silk Road, perhaps a merchant, encountering a local practitioner who offers to ensure a safe journey by preparing a small figure blessed with protective words, or perhaps to gain an advantage over a competitor in the next market town using a less savory method involving an effigy. Syncretism is the key word here. It's the blending of different religious or cultural beliefs and practices. As the use of magical figures spread across Eurasia in the early medieval period, it didn't just replace existing practices, it fused with them. Local beliefs about spirits, demons, healing, and the power of images combined with the core idea inherited from the classical or earlier Near Eastern traditions. A figure might be made of clay, as before, but now perhaps inscribed with verses from the Quran, or blessed in the name of a Byzantine saint, or buried with amulets from a local pagan tradition. One quirky or fringe tidbit from this period is the appearance of magical figures described in texts like the Picatrix, a famous medieval grimoire, a book of magic, that circulated in both Arabic and Latin. This text, compiled from various sources, discusses the creation and use of images, which often means figures or talismans, in complex astrological magic. It details how to create figures at specific astrological timings, using particular materials to achieve various effects, from attracting love to causing discord. While not always anthropomorphic dolls, the principle of imbuing and crafted object with power through ritual and sympathetic connection is a direct continuation of the practices we've been tracing. The Picatrix is full of wild ideas, like making lead figures to influence battles or wax figures to control emotions. Stuff that probably kept people up at night for different reasons. The spread wasn't just east, it was north and west as well. As the Roman Empire declined in the west, various Germanic and Slavic peoples established new kingdoms. While archaeological evidence for figure use in magic from this period is perhaps less abundant or harder to interpret than in the classical or Byzantine world, textual sources and later folklore suggest that the idea of using effigies in rituals persisted or re-emerged. Think of the straw figures burned in effigy rituals common in later European folklore, or the descriptions of magical images used by witches in medieval trials, though these are often biased and unreliable sources. The line isn't always direct, but the underlying concept seems incredibly resilient. Historians still argue whether the continuity of figure use in magic across medieval Eurasia was a direct, unbroken line of transmission from antiquity, or if similar ideas arose independently in different cultures due to common human psychology and beliefs about sympathetic magic. Was it Rome directly influencing Byzantium and then flowing east? Or did independent traditions of using images for magic exist in Persia or elsewhere that then interacted with incoming classical ideas? The answer is likely a messy combination of both, with ideas traveling along trade routes, being carried by migrating peoples, and being reinvented in new cultural contexts. It's tricky to untangle precisely how much is inheritance and how much is convergence. This journey eastward and into the medieval period shows the adaptability of our core concept. The figures change shape, the materials might vary, the deities or spirits invoked are different, and the specific rituals are tailored to new religious or cultural frameworks. But the fundamental belief that you can craft something small and inanimate, like a clay figure, and make it a proxy for something powerful and perhaps terrifying, like a nightmare, remains a potent idea. The medieval world, with its rich blend of traditions and its deep fascination with the unseen, provides fertile ground for this idea to continue its evolution. It sets the stage for how these practices might eventually arrive closer to home, potentially influencing how people thought about trapping unwanted spirits or bad dreams in a physical form. Consider the sheer logistics of this cultural exchange. Every caravan, every ship, every migrating group wasn't just carrying goods. They were carrying stories, beliefs, and practical knowledge, including recipes for potions, incantations, and instructions for crafting magical objects. Imagine a merchant arriving in a new city, hearing hushed tales of a local sorcerer who could make an image of someone and cause them to fall ill, or perhaps create a protective figure to place under the threshold. These stories, even if exaggerated, kept the idea of figure magic alive and allowed it to spread, adapting to the fears and needs of different communities across this vast, interconnected medieval world. And through it all, our simple lump of clay or wax or lead continued its long, strange career as a tool for influencing the forces that shape human life, including perhaps the ones that haunt your sleep. So you've journeyed with the idea of crafting figures for influence, following its trail across the vibrant melting pot of ancient cultures, seeing it adapt and persist through the Byzantine Empire and along the complex roots of medieval Eurasia. Now let's bring our focus west, back towards the fragmented landscape that emerged after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, and into the heart of what we commonly understand as the European Middle Ages. The picture here is different from the East, marked by different power structures, the rise of feudalism, and the increasing dominance of the Catholic Church, which brought its own unique lens to the world of magic and the unseen. While Byzantium maintained a more direct line to classical traditions, the West saw a period of greater upheaval and decentralization. Yet the fundamental idea of making a physical representation to affect a target didn't vanish. It persisted in the diverse tapestry of European folk practices, often passed down through generations, blending with indigenous beliefs that predated Christianity. Think of the old ways of the land, the connection to nature, the belief in spirits dwelling in trees and streams, the rituals tied to the agricultural cycle. These ancient undercurrents mingled with remnants of Roman practices and, increasingly, with the framework of the new dominant religion. Figures, or effigies as they were often called, continued to appear in various forms. You might find simple figures made of wax, clay, or even bound twigs and cloth, used in rituals for healing, protection, or finding lost things. A sick person's illness might be ritually transferred into an effigy and then disposed of, a form of sympathetic magic where the figure stands in for the person. Or perhaps a figure might be placed in a field to protect crops from blight, a small, silent guardian crafted with hope in local wisdom. These practices were often part of the fabric of daily life, sometimes tolerated by the church, sometimes viewed with suspicion as mere superstition, or worse. As the Middle Ages progressed, particularly from the High Middle Ages, roughly 11th to 13th centuries, onwards, there was a significant development that profoundly changed how figure magic was perceived: the formalization and expansion of Christian demonology. For this, magical practices were often seen as misguided attempts to manipulate natural forces, or perhaps involving minor spirits or pagan deities. But the Church, in its efforts to define orthodoxy and combat perceived threats, began to develop a more sophisticated theology of evil. The devil and his legions of demons weren't just abstract concepts. They were active agents seeking to corrupt souls and cause harm in the world. Suddenly, using figures to cause harm, a practice known as maleficium, was no longer just a potentially dangerous or irreligious act. It was evidence of a pact with the devil. If you made a wax figure of your enemy and stuck pins in it, according to this new framework, you weren't just trying to hurt them through some esoteric natural law or the power of your own will. You were explicitly or implicitly calling upon demonic power to achieve your goal. The figure became not just a tool, but potentially a vessel for demonic influence, a direct link forged with the forces of evil. This shift had devastating consequences. It laid the groundwork for the witch hunts that would terrorize Europe in the late medieval and early modern periods. Finding a wax or clay figure in someone's possession, especially if they were already suspected of witchcraft, became powerful and damning evidence. Accusations often included details of how alleged witches used these figures, melting them by a fire to cause a person to waste away, sticking pins in specific places to inflict pain or paralysis, or burying them to bring about death or misfortune. This is a mainstream historical fact. The use of figures, effigies, dolls, in alleged maleficium became a central accusation in European witchcraft trials, interpreted through the lens of demonic conspiracy. Think of the chilling descriptions in texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, the infamous guide for witch hunters, which detailed such practices as evidence of demonic power working through human agents. It's heavy stuff, maybe not ideal for drifting off, but stick with me, it's part of the story. One quirky or fringe tidbit from this era involves not just the harmful use of figures, but also the idea of animating them, perhaps as protective servants or even companions. While not exactly the trapping nightmares concept we started with, the medieval fascination with creating artificial life, seen in legends like the Golem of Prague, which is later but has roots in older ideas, or early alchemical texts describing the creation of homunculi, shows a parallel strand of thought: the desire to imbue an inanimate figure with a semblance of life or power. Some medieval grimoires, often mixing astrology, alchemy, and magical invocations, contained recipes for creating images, figures, or talismans for various purposes, some involving complex rituals to call down celestial or spiritual forces into the object. These weren't always simple folk charms. They could be part of a learned, albeit often condemned, magical tradition. Imagine someone meticulously crafting a small lead figure under a specific planetary alignment, chanting incantations from a forbidden manuscript, believing they were imbuing it with powerful cosmic energy. A bit more involved than just squeezing some mud. The perception of figures in magic became deeply polarized during the Middle Ages. On one hand, you had simple folk charms potentially involving figures, often viewed with a mix of tolerance and mild disapproval. On the other hand, you had the terrifying specter of figures used in maleficium, linked directly to heresy and the devil, leading to accusations, torture, and execution. The innocent clay doll, perhaps once a protective household spirit, could now be seen as a tool of ultimate evil. Historians still argue whether the extensive accounts of witches using figures in trials reflect actual widespread practice among accused individuals, or whether these were largely descriptions imposed by interrogators and demonologists based on their own preconceived notions of what demonic magic must involve. Were ordinary people genuinely engaged in elaborate rituals with figures intended to cause harm through demonic means? Or were simpler folk practices interpreted and distorted by authorities through the dark mirror of their burgeoning demonology? It's incredibly difficult to separate genuine belief and practice from the narratives constructed by persecutors. So, in medieval Europe, our story takes a darker turn. The figure, a simple object, becomes tangled up with profound theological anxieties and the terrifying power of the Inquisition. It's no longer just about influence or even protection. It's about the perceived battle between good and evil, played out in miniature with wax and pins. This transformation in perception, this embedding of figure magic within the narrative of demonic witchcraft, profoundly shaped how these objects would be viewed for centuries to come, turning them into enduring symbols of forbidden, dangerous power. And while the connection to trapping nightmares might seem less explicit here, the idea of the figure as a vessel for malevolent forces, whether demonic or simply harmful intent, certainly resonates with the concept of containing something dark and unwanted. It's a small leap from binding a harmful spell to binding a harmful dream, especially if both are seen as manifestations of negative, perhaps spiritual energies. The stage is set for our figures to carry the heavy baggage of these medieval fears as they move forward in time. So you've seen how the humble figure got tangled up with the truly terrifying machinery of the witch hunts, becoming a loaded symbol of perceived demonic activity and maleficium. The peak intensity of these trials, roughly from the 15th to the 18th centuries in various parts of Europe and later North America, was brutal. And the figure, particularly the wax or clay effigy, played a starring role in many accusations and forced confessions. But as the Enlightenment began to dawn, bringing with it a shift towards reason, science, and a gradual, very gradual skepticism towards widespread demonic conspiracy theories, The legal prosecution of witchcraft waned. The laws changed, the courts became less inclined to accept spectral evidence or confessions extracted under torture, and the mass hysteria eventually subsided. Does this mean the figures vanished? Absolutely not. They simply retreated from the courtroom back into the shadows of folklore, local belief, and less overtly theological systems of magic and superstition. While the grand narratives of the diabolical pacts faded in official discourse, the deeply ingrained belief in curses, hexes, and the power of sympathetic magic, the idea that like affects like, persisted strongly in popular culture. You might find that our little figures resurfaced in less dramatic forms. Perhaps a figure was still used in a love charm, bound with threads of intention and personal objects. Or maybe it became part of a folk healing ritual, drawing illness away from the body. And yes, the idea of the figure as a tool for causing harm, the direct descendant of the witch trial effigy, certainly didn't disappear. It survived in the dark corners of folk magic, whispered about in hushed tones, associated with grudges, jealousy, and the desire for revenge. The infamous voodoo doll, which we'll get to later, is a complex example of this idea persisting and evolving, incorporating elements from different traditions and unfortunately becoming heavily stereotyped and sensationalized. This persistence highlights a mainstream historical fact. Long after the official end of the witch trials, the belief in sympathetic magic and the use of figures or effigies for casting spells, both beneficial and harmful, remained a feature of folk practices across Europe and in communities influenced by European traditions. While the theological framework shifted, the practical application of figures in magic continued, often under the radar of official religious or legal authority. It's like the official story changed, but the paperback fan fiction kept getting passed around underground. Consider the figure's journey from something potentially used in a sophisticated, albeit condemned, learned magical practice involving astrology and complex rituals, as we touched on with medieval grimoires, to something much simpler and more immediate in folk belief. A figure could be crudely shaped from earth from a grave, bound with hair or fingernails, and used to curse an enemy, a practice far removed from planetary alignments, but deeply rooted in the power of physical connection and intention. These weren't necessarily devils at work, just the raw, messy emotions of human life channeled into a physical form. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this post-witch trial era involves the curious practice of creating figures specifically to ward off evil or bad luck, sometimes even incorporating protective objects like nails, pins, or written spells inside the figure. These weren't intended to cause harm to others, but rather to act as personal shields or guardians. Imagine a small, lumpy figure hidden above a doorway or buried under the hearth, crafted not out of malice, but out of a desperate hope for safety and peace. Sometimes these figures were made by the person seeking protection, imbuing it with their own energy and need. It's a fascinating inversion. The same object used for harm could also be created with the opposite intention, becoming a tiny, silent sentinel against misfortune. As society continued to change, industrialization took hold, and urban populations grew, these folk practices didn't vanish, but they often became more localized or adapted. The figure started to take on new forms and roles, influenced by changing materials and cultural exchanges. And importantly, it started to intersect more explicitly with the world of toys and play. Think about it. A child's doll is, at its heart, a figure representing a person. While the primary purpose is play and companionship, the idea of a figure embodying something else, an identity, a narrative, emotions, is shared. The transition from a ritually charged effigy to a mass-produced toy is a massive cultural leap, but it's built on the same fundamental human tendency to create anthropomorphic objects and imbue them with meaning. Historians still argue whether the rise of the modern doll as a children's toy in the 18th and 19th centuries owes anything significant to the earlier traditions of magical or ritualistic figures, or if it was a largely separate development driven by changing ideas about childhood, domesticity, and manufacturing. Did the doll evolve from the effigy Or did they just happen to share a similar form because humans like making little people? It's a classic chicken and egg history problem. The figure, in its journey through this period, shed some of its overt, legally condemned baggage, but it retained its power in the collective unconscious and in hidden practices. It continued to represent a focal point for intention, a physical anchor for the non-physical, be it a curse, a blessing, a lost love, or a hoped-for recovery. And as the world became smaller through trade and travel, the concept, if not the specific form, of using figures in sympathetic magic continued to circulate and blend with practices from different cultures, paving the way for its global reach and diverse manifestations we see today, including, eventually, the idea of trapping something as intangible as a nightmare. From the gallows to the nursery, metaphorically speaking, of course, hopefully no actual effigies ended up in cribs. The figure's path reflects the complex interplay between official history, enduring folklore, fear, hope, and the simple human act of shaping materials into recognizable forms. And while the witch hunts faded, the potent image of the figure as a vessel for powerful hidden forces remained, ready to be repurposed for new beliefs and new anxieties. So our little figure, having survived the witch hunts and retreated into the quieter corners of European folklore, didn't stay put. History, as you know, isn't a series of isolated islands. It's a vast, interconnected ocean, and people, ideas, and yes, even strange little clay or wax figures travel across it. With the age of exploration, colonization, and the brutal transatlantic slave trade, cultural currents mixed and clashed in often violent and transformative ways. And in these tumultuous waters, the idea of the figure as a vessel for intention, a focus for power, found fertile ground in new lands and merged with existing beliefs. While Europeans certainly brought their concepts of sympathetic magic and effigy use with them, it's crucial to understand that they weren't arriving in empty cultural landscapes. Indigenous peoples across the Americas and various African cultures forcibly brought to the Americas had their own rich traditions of using objects, images, and rituals to influence the world around them. The figure concept didn't just get exported, it got remixed, reinterpreted, and sometimes fundamentally changed through a process of cultural exchange, adaptation, and resistance. Think of it less like dropping a single pebble into a pond, and more like pouring several different colored liquids into a container and swirling them around. You get something new, sometimes vibrant, sometimes murky. This is where the figure gets tangled up with one of its most famous and most misunderstood manifestations, the voodoo doll. Now let's clear something up right away, because the popular image you probably have in your head is largely a creation of sensationalism and prejudice. The actual complex religious traditions often lumped under the term voodoo, like Haitian voodoo, Louisiana voodoo, and West African vodun, which are distinct but related, are not at their core about sticking pins into dolls to hurt people. That simple, malevolent image is like saying Christianity is just about snake handling. It ignores the vast majority of beliefs, practices, and ethical frameworks. Mainstream historical fact coming at you. The popular Western image of the voodoo doll, used exclusively for cursing and harm, bears very little resemblance to the practices of actual Haitian voodoo or West African vodun, where figures might be used in rituals related to honoring spirits, healing, or sometimes protection. But the simple cursed doll trope is largely a European and American invention, popularized through fiction and discriminatory portrayals. It's a classic case of cultural misunderstanding amplified by fear and exoticism. So where did this potent, scary image come from? It's a messy blend of factors. European ideas about witchcraft effigies certainly played a role, particularly in the context of the Americas, where enslaved Africans and their descendants developed new syncretic religions that incorporated elements from their diverse African origins, Catholicism, and local beliefs. But the specific image of the voodoo doll, as we know it today, the crude doll with pins for causing pain, really took off in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, fueled by racist portrayals in pulp fiction, lurid travelogues, and eventually Hollywood horror movies. These depictions often presented voodoo as inherently evil, barbaric, and focus solely on harm, stripping away its complex spirituality, community functions, and ethical dimensions. It was a convenient narrative for justifying oppression. It's like history decided to write a bad B-movie script and cast the figure as the villain. This leads us to a bit of a scholarly debate. To what extent did the European witch trial effigy tradition directly influence the development of figure use in New World syncretic religions? And to what extent were these practices independent developments based on similar underlying principles of sympathetic magic present in both African and European traditions? Historians and anthropologists still argue whether the voodoo doll image is primarily a distorted echo of European witchcraft effigies projected onto African-derived religions, or if there were genuine, though perhaps less common or less central, uses of figures for malevolent magic within some folk practices in the Americas that got exaggerated and sensationalized. It's likely a bit of both, a tangled knot of influences and misrepresentations. Let's dive a little deeper into the sympathetic magic angle. Regardless of the specific culture or the ethics involved, the fundamental principle behind using a figure to influence a person remains remarkably consistent. The idea that actions performed on the figure will affect the person it represents. This is contagious magic using something connected to the person, like hair or clothes, combined with imitative magic, the figure looking like the person. It's a powerful intuitive concept, isn't it? You create a miniature version of someone, you bind it to them with some personal link, and then you interact with the miniature, believing it directly impacts the original. It feels logical on some primal level, even if modern science tells us it's not how physics works. Unless you're trying to fold laundry by folding a tiny doll-sized shirt, which, trust me, doesn't work. I've tried, for science. In actual folk practices in the Caribbean and southern US, figures are sometimes used, but often in ways far removed from the pin-sticking stereotype. A figure might be used in a healing ritual, representing the patient. An illness is drawn out of it, or it might be dressed and placed on an altar as a representation of a spirit or ancestor. A quirky or fringe tidbit here. In some folk traditions, figures aren't just used to represent people, but also specific problems or negative conditions. You might create a figure embodying bad luck or debt, and then ritualistically destroy it or bury it to get rid of the problem. So the figure becomes a container, not just for a person's essence, but for abstract concepts you want to manipulate. It's a very concrete way of dealing with intangible worries. The voodoo doll stereotype, despite being inaccurate and harmful, became incredibly potent in the global imagination. It solidified the figure's image in the public consciousness primarily as a tool for malevolent magic. It's probably the first thing many people think of when they hear about figures being used in rituals. This persistent image overshadows the figure's other historical uses in healing, protection, divination, or even just as simple representations. It's like one really loud, inaccurate rumor drowned out all the nuanced truth. Think about the poor figure caught in this. For centuries, it was many things: a religious idol, a grave good, a ritual placeholder, a focus for learned magic, a symbol of witchcraft fear, a folk charm. Then, largely thanks to colonial fear and racist propaganda, it got reduced to a single terrifying purpose in the popular mind. This reduction is part of the figure's journey, simplifying its complex history into an easily digestible and often harmful trope. You went from needing detailed astrological charts or complex incantations to just needing some fabric scraps, stuffing, and a box of pins. Efficiency, I guess? Though ethically dubious. This global journey shows how the same basic concept, a figure representing something else, can be interpreted wildly differently across cultures and time periods. It can be sacred, mundane, feared, or even trivialized. And the power attributed to it often reflects the fears and desires of the people using it, or in the case of the voodoo doll stereotype, the fears and prejudices of those looking in from the outside. So as our story continues, keep this global perspective in mind. The figure isn't just a European phenomenon. It's a human one, adapting and changing as it travels the world, absorbing new meanings and shedding old ones, sometimes unfairly burdened by the weight of misunderstanding and historical baggage. And it's this adaptability, this ability to be many things to many people, that will eventually loop back around to our initial question about trapping something as elusive and personal as a nightmare. How does something associated with cursing or praying become a vessel for bad dreams? That leap requires another turn in the figure's long, strange journey. So you've seen how this seemingly simple idea, making a little figure to represent something bigger, traveled the world, morphing from sacred idols to feared witchcraft tools, getting tangled up in colonialism and misrepresentation along the way. It had quite the dramatic life, didn't it? But as Western society moved further into the age of science, reason, and mass production, the figure, in its more overtly magical or religious forms, began to fade from the center stage. Those grand rituals, the intricate astrological timings, the public accusations of effigy use in witchcraft trials, they started to recede into the background of history, becoming curiosities for scholars or fuel for Gothic novels. As the formal, adult world increasingly dismissed magic as superstition, the figure seemed to lose some of its perceived power. It wasn't really needed anymore for diplomatic curses or state-sponsored idolatry, but things rarely disappear entirely. They just change form, finding new niches, often in the quieter, less scrutinized corners of life. And one of the places the figure retreated to was the realm of folk belief, domestic practice, and eventually, the world of childhood. Think about it. While Enlightenment thinkers were busy categorizing the natural world and steam engines were starting to reshape industry, everyday fears and worries didn't vanish. People still worried about illness, bad luck, and yes, the things that went bump in the night, both literal and figurative. And in these less formal spaces, objects still held meaning. A lucky charm, a religious medal, a family heirloom, they all carried a weight beyond their material substance. The figure, having proven its adaptability for millennia, found a new purpose here. It shifted from being a tool for manipulating powerful forces or specific enemies to becoming something more personal, often associated with protection. Perhaps it's because figures inherently represent individuals, and who needs protection more than the vulnerable? Children in particular are seen as needing safeguards against unseen threats, things that adults might rationalize away, but which feel very real in the dark. This is where the figure starts its subtle pivot from the grand narratives of power and fear to the intimate, vulnerable space of sleep and dreams. It's a less dramatic role, perhaps, but no less significant in the lives of the people who used it. This brings us closer to the core of our topic. The figure, no longer primarily a tool for cursing your neighbor or praying to a distant deity in mainstream Western practice, began to surface in connection with things like safeguarding children. This protective impulse, combined with the figure's inherent ability to represent something, laid the groundwork for it to become associated with protecting against something abstract but deeply personal: the nightmare. Now you might think, wait, we just talked about scary voodoo dolls. How does that lead to something about nightmares? And it's a fair point, but remember how the figure's meaning was so fluid? The voodoo doll stereotype, while globally famous and often used to portray malevolence, was just one chapter. Before and after that, the figure was used for healing, for honoring, for countless other things. The principle wasn't inherently good or evil. It was about representation and intention. If you can use a figure to represent an enemy you want to harm, or a god you want to appease, or a sick person you want to heal, why couldn't you use it to represent a problem you want to contain? This is where the idea of the figure as a container or a vessel really comes into play in a new way. Historically, figures might contain part of a person, like hair, or represent the person entirely. But the idea of containing something abstract, like fear or a bad dream, is a slightly different twist. It's an application of sympathetic magic not just to a person, but to a psychological state. You externalize the internal terror, give it physical form in the figure, and then you can interact with that form to control the terror. Let's talk about a mainstream historical fact that underscores this shift away from formal magic. Following the Age of Enlightenment in Europe, roughly 18th century onwards, there was a significant decline in the widespread belief among educated elites and increasingly the general populace in the efficacy of overt magical practices, including the use of effigies for purposes like cursing or grand rituals. While folk beliefs persisted, the figure lost its prominence in courtrooms, churches, and the public imagination as a tool of significant power over others, being increasingly viewed through a lens of superstition rather than genuine threat, though fears lingered in some corners. This cleared the way, in a strange sense, for the figure to be reinterpreted for more personal, less powerful applications. So as the figure faded from the grand stage, it found work in the supporting cast, often in the quiet dramas of everyday life. And dealing with nightmares? That's definitely part of the quiet drama of life, especially for kids. This is where we start seeing the figure becoming less about causing pain or influencing distant events, and more about providing comfort, protection, or acting as a tangible focus for anxieties. It's a psychological shift reflected in the object's use. You're not trying to hurt someone across the ocean. You're trying to help someone in the next room sleep soundly. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit related to this, while the modern nightmare doll is a fairly recent concept in its popular form, there are older folk traditions, particularly in certain parts of Europe, that involve creating specific objects, sometimes small figures, but also woven items, knotted strings, or even just stones, and placing them near a sleeping person to ward off bad dreams or spirits believed to cause them. These weren't always human figures. Sometimes they were abstract shapes or representations of protective animals. The core idea was similar: create a physical object that has a protective property, often imbued through simple ritual or prayer, and use its presence to safeguard the sleeper. It shows that the concept of an object protecting against bad dreams isn't brand new, even if the specific figure-based approach for nightmares is more recent. It's like history was prototyping the idea for centuries. This leads neatly into an open scholarly debate. Historians and folklorists still argue whether the modern concept of a nightmare doll, specifically designed to trap or ward off bad dreams, evolved directly from older protective figure traditions, or was a relatively independent development influenced more by modern psychology's understanding of externalizing fears or commercial trends creating new comforting objects for children. Is it a continuous lineage from ancient protective effigies, or a contemporary invention drawing on deep-seated human tendencies to personify or objectify abstract problems? It's a bit like trying to trace the family tree of a stray cat. You know it has ancestors, but the exact line is hard to pin down. Regardless of its precise lineage, the idea gained attraction. The figure could represent the fear, the bad dream itself, or the child being protected from it. And by focusing intention or action on the figure, you could influence the outcome. If the figure represents the nightmare, you might contain it within the figure. If it represents the child, the figure could be a guardian. The flexibility is what makes the figure so persistent. It's fascinating how an object that was once burned in effigy to symbolize the destruction of an enemy, or painstakingly crafted from precious materials to house a god, could end up being a stuffed fabric or clay figure sitting on a child's bedside table, tasked with the con of absorbing spooky dreams. It's a journey from the public square and sacred temple to the intimate, dimly lit space of a bedroom. This shift reflects changing societies, changing beliefs, and changing fears. The fear of witchcraft and powerful enemies might have receded, but the fear of the unknown, the fear that manifests in our sleep, is timeless. And think about the psychology of it. For a child, or even an adult struggling with anxieties, giving a shape and form to something intangible like a nightmare can be incredibly powerful. You take the swirling, formless terror in your head and say, okay, you are this little figure now. It makes the problem feel more manageable, something you can point to, talk to, or interact with. It gives you a sense of agency over something that felt uncontrollable. It's a tangible anchor in the storm of the subconscious. Maybe the figure doesn't literally trap the nightmare, unless nightmares are made of tiny capturable particles, which probably not, but it helps the person feel like they are trapping it, or at least doing something active to combat it. This domestic, personal, and increasingly psychological application of the figure is a crucial turn in its story. It steps away from the grand, external battles and enters the internal landscape of fears and vulnerabilities. And it is precisely this evolution, this movement from public ritual to private comfort, that sets the stage for the specific, perhaps slightly whimsical idea of the figure designed to absorb or contain nightmares in clay. It's a modern twist on ancient principles, tailored for a specific, relatable human experience. The fear of the dark and what lurks in our sleeping minds. The figure, ever the adaptable shapeshifter of history, finds its new purpose waiting by the bed. So you follow the figure's meandering path from ancient times, through grand rituals, across continents, surviving persecution, and finally landing in the slightly less dramatic, more personal space of domestic fears and comfort. It's shed its political power and terrifying reputation, settling into a role more aligned with protection and containment, especially when it comes to the nebulous things that scare us in the dark. And as this concept that a figure can somehow interact with intangible fears solidified, a particular material often emerged as the perfect medium for this delicate task: clay. Now, why clay? Of all the materials humanity has worked with, wood, stone, metal, bone, fabric, what makes humble clay so suitable for the push of potentially trapping a nightmare? Well, think about clay for a moment. It's earth, right? Dirt, mud. It's the ground beneath your feet, the stuff of riverbanks and ancient seabeds. It's primal. It's literally the stuff you're made of, according to some creation myths. There's an inherent connection to the fundamental, the elemental, the grounded reality of existence. But more than its symbolic weight, clay has incredible practical properties. It's gloriously, forgivingly malleable. When wet, it responds instantly to your touch. You can pinch it, roll it, twist it, flatten it, sculpt it into literally any shape you can imagine. Want to make a figure with big, sad eyes? Easy. Want sharp, pointy teeth? No problem. Want it to look like a blob with anxieties? Clay's got you covered. This ability to take on forms so readily is crucial. If you're trying to give shape to something formless and terrifying like a nightmare, a material that you can mold with your own hands, that mirrors the fluidity of thought and fear before hardening, feels incredibly appropriate, doesn't it? You can literally shape the fear. You can imagine the swirling chaos in your head, the jumble of scary images, the anxious feelings, and you can try to put that into the figure. Maybe the nightmare feels heavy and lumpy. You make a heavy, lumpy figure. Maybe it feels sharp and jagged. You can pinch the clay into points. The act of shaping itself is a process of externalization, of taking the internal monster and giving it an outer skin. It's like saying, okay, I see you, nightmare, and I'm going to put you right here in this little lump of clay. And then comes the magic trick of clay. It hardens. Whether simply left to air dry or subjected to the transformative heat of a kiln, that soft, yielding mud becomes solid, rigid, fixed. This transformation is key to the idea of containment. You've captured the essence, the representation, the idea of the nightmare in the soft clay while you were shaping it. Then, as the clay dries or is fired, it traps that essence, holding it fast. The nightmare, previously ephemeral and unbound, is now fixed within the solid form. It can't float away, it can't seep out, it can't chase you anymore. It's stuck, it's contained. This fundamental process, shaping softness into enduring form, has made clay indispensable throughout human history. Think about early tools, pots for storing food and water, building materials, but also think about the meaning we've imbued in clay. We write on it cuneiform tablets, remember? We bury our dead in vessels made of it. We sculpt gods and ancestors from it. Clay figures are among the very oldest artifacts humans have created. They appear in almost every culture, serving incredibly diverse purposes. For a mainstream historical fact, clay figures, often small and hand-molded, are found in archaeological sites across the globe dating back tens of thousands of years. Some of the earliest examples are the so-called Venus figurines, small, often faceless female figures found across Eurasia, dating back to the Upper Paleolithic period, over 25,000 years ago. While their exact purpose is debated, fertility symbols, representations of goddesses, amulets, self-portraits, their sheer ubiquity and age demonstrate that humans have used clay to create meaningful figures for an incredibly long time, attaching significance and perhaps even perceived power to these earthy forms right from the get-go. This deep historical connection between clay and the creation of meaningful, symbolic figures provides a powerful backdrop for its later use in more specific protective practices. Now, let's get our hands a little metaphorical mud. When you're working with clay, there's a very tactile, grounding experience. It feels cool and damp, earthy and responsive. It's a direct connection to the material world, a physical activity in an age often dominated by screens and abstraction. Maybe part of the power of using clay for something like containing a nightmare comes from this very real, very physical engagement. You're not just thinking about the nightmare, you're physically doing something about it, using a material that feels ancient and real. It's like getting your hands dirty to clean up the mess in your head. This physical interaction is key. It's not just about the finished object, it's the process. The kneading, the shaping, the focusing of intent as your fingers press into the yielding earth. It's a small ritual in itself. And for something as personal as a nightmare, a solitary, tactile act like molding clay feels appropriate. It's quiet, introspective, and entirely in your control. You can't wrestle a nightmare, but you can certainly wrestle a lump of clay into submission. The use of clay figures for protection or warding off negative influences isn't just a modern idea linked to nightmares. Historically, clay has been used in various folk practices for protection. For instance, in some traditions, small clay figures were placed at thresholds or buried under foundations to protect a building and its inhabitants from evil spirits or bad luck. Others involved making a clay figure representing a sick person and performing rituals over it to draw the illness out of the person and into the figure, which would then be destroyed or purified. It's the same underlying principle. The figure represents something, and the action taken upon the figure affects the thing it represents. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit. In some agricultural societies, small clay figures were made in the shape of livestock and placed in barns or fields as a form of sympathetic magic, intended to ensure the health and fertility of the actual animals or crops, protecting them from disease or pests. Sometimes these figures were made from the very soil of the field they were meant to protect. It's a beautiful, humble practice, using the earth itself to ask the earth for bounty and protection. These weren't elaborate sculptures, they were simple, heartfelt appeals molded from mud. So you have this material, clay, deeply entwined with human history, inherently malleable, capable of becoming permanently solid, and already associated with creating significant figures for ritual, protection, and representation across countless cultures. It seems like a natural fit for the task of taking something as fluid and terrifying as a nightmare and making it solid, contained, and manageable. You can scoop up a bit of earth, shape your fear into a little doll or creature, let it harden, and feel that the fear is now fixed outside of you. Historians and folklorists still argue whether the specific practice of creating small clay figures, specifically for the purpose of trapping or containing nightmares, is a truly ancient, unbroken tradition or a more recent syncretic development. Did cultures thousands of years ago literally make clay figures and say, okay, this one's for the bad dreams? Or is it a more modern interpretation, perhaps influenced by psychological ideas about externalization, which simply adopts the age-old, globally familiar medium of clay figures as its vehicle? It's difficult to find explicit historical texts saying, and then, to prevent the night terrors, sculpt a small person from river mud. The evidence is often inferred from archaeological finds or later folk practices. So while the components, clay figures, protective rituals, dealing with bad omens, spirits, are ancient, putting them together specifically for nightmares in a clay doll might be a newer twist on an old theme. Think about the sensory experience again. Imagine sitting quietly, maybe in the evening light, with a lump of clay. You feel the cool weight in your hands. the slight resistance as you begin to work it. The earthy smell is grounding. As you shape it, you can talk to it, whispering your fears or instructions. You are actively creating something tangible to confront the intangible. It's a form of active coping, a physical manifestation of the desire for control over something uncontrollable. The simplicity of the material makes the process accessible. You don't need special tools or skills, just your hands and some earth. The choice of clay also feels fitting because it's humble. It's not gold or silver or carved ivory, it's dirt. This underscores the domestic, accessible nature of the practice. It's something anyone could do, anywhere there's clay. It's folk magic in its most down-to-earth form. Pun intended, couldn't resist. It contrasts sharply with the elaborate, expensive rituals associated with powerful effigies used in state-level curses or high religious ceremonies we touched upon earlier. This is bedroom magic, kitchen countercraft, something quiet and personal. And once the clay figure is hardened, what then? The possibilities align beautifully with the containment concept. You can place it somewhere safe, maybe under the bed or on a shelf, believing it is holding the nightmare captive. You could ritualistically bury it, returning the captured fear to the earth. You could break it, symbolically destroying the nightmare. Or maybe if the figure is meant to protect from nightmares rather than contain them, it becomes a permanent guardian watching over the sleeper. The solid, enduring form of the clay figure allows for these final, meaningful actions. So, the journey of the figure from terrifying curse tool and divine representation to personal protector against unseen horrors finds a perfect physical embodiment in clay. The material's ancient pedigree, its effortless malleability, its transformative hardening, and its humble accessibility all combine to make it the ideal substance for crafting these small anchors against the storm of sleep. It's taking the fundamental stuff of the earth and imbuing it with the power to hold on to the ephemeral terrors of the night. From dirt to protector, it's quite a transformation, isn't it? Much like the figure itself has transformed its role over millennia. So you understand the weakness why. You're immersed in a world where the night is a spiritual battlefield, and your sleeping self is dangerously exposed to forces you can't see, but can certainly feel when they manifest as waking terror. Now you need the how. You've had the nightmare, maybe that one about your teeth falling out, but way worse, involving actual soul-eating demons and the distinct smell of sulfur. You wake up, heart pounding, sweat cold on your skin. The sun isn't up yet, and the shadows in your hut look suspiciously like the things from your dream. What do you do? How do you go from pure primal fear to actively trapping that fear in a lump of clay? This is where the fragmented instructions, the whispers across millennia, begin to coalesce into a potential ritual sequence. Imagine the morning after, or perhaps even in the fading hours of pre-dawn darkness, your sleep ruined. You need materials. Clay, of course, is paramount. Not just any clay, perhaps. Maybe it needed to be dug from a specific spot, consecrated ground, a place known for its protective properties, or perhaps a liminal space like a riverbank. The gathering itself might be part of the ritual, a quiet act performed with intention, perhaps reciting hushed words as you work the damp earth free. You feel the cool, yielding texture in your hands, the fine grit against your palms. It's raw, elemental, straight from the earth that sustains you and will eventually reclaim you. It holds the potential for form, for containing something formless. Once you have the clay, you need to prepare it, kneading out the air bubbles, making it pliable. As you work it, you focus your mind, not just on the clay, but on the nightmare itself. You deliberately recall the terrifying images, the oppressive feeling, the presence that invaded your sleep. This isn't pleasant. It's like willingly stepping back into the horror. But with a purpose now, you are identifying the enemy. You are giving it substance, making it tangible in your mind so you can transfer it into the clay. This act of focused remembrance is crucial. You're not just making a generic doll, you're crafting a vessel specifically for that nightmare, that entity, that fear. Now comes the shaping. You begin to mold the clay. Does it need to look like something specific? Perhaps. Some interpretations suggest these dolls might be anthropomorphic, rough human shapes. Others hint at monstrous forms, literal representations of the demons or creatures from the dream. Or maybe, and this is a quirky or fringe tidbit that adds a layer of strange specificity, the instructions dictated a symbolic shape, a knot, a barrier, something abstract that represents containment or the specific nature of the dream's threat. You shape it deliberately, perhaps pinching out a head, rudimentary limbs. As you work, you continue to focus on the nightmare, pouring the feeling of dread, the visual details, the whispered threats from your dream state into the physical form taking shape under your fingers. It's an act of transference, willing the intangible horror into the tangible clay. Think of it like 3D printing your trauma, but with mud and ancient prayers. Once the basic form is complete, or as you are shaping it, the ritual gets more intense. You might breathe onto the figure, literally transferring a part of yourself connected to the nightmare you experienced into the clay. You might whisper the details of the dream to the doll, recounting the terrifying events aloud, trapping the narrative, the very essence of the nightmare, within its muddy shell. You are telling the doll, you are that fear, you are that demon, you are my nightmare. Some practices involve spitting on the effigy, a common way across many cultures to transfer or bind something. In this case, perhaps binding the nightmare to the doll, or using the spittle as a symbolic representation of the nightmare's unpleasantness or toxicity. You might press a fingernail into the clay, leaving a mark of ownership, of connection. This act of naming, breathing upon, whispering to, and touching the doll is crucial. It imbues the inert clay with the identity of the nightmare. You are, in essence, creating a magical double, a proxy for the terrifying experience or the entity causing it. It's sympathetic magic in action. By manipulating the doll, you believe you can manipulate the nightmare itself. You are no longer the helpless victim in the dream. You are the active agent creating a trap. After the nightmare is successfully, hopefully, transferred into the clay figure, the critical step of containment follows. How do you ensure it stays there? You can't just leave the scary little clay person lying around. The instructions likely involve sealing it away. This could take several forms. You might wrap the figure tightly in cloth, binding it physically, symbolizing the binding of the nightmare. You might place it inside a small pot or a specially made clay box, sealing the lid shut. Or, and this is perhaps the most final and common method suggested by archaeological finds of small, often broken, figurines buried in specific locations. You might bury the doll, digging a small hole, placing the figure inside, and covering it with earth. Burying something is a potent symbol of putting it away, returning it to the inertness of the ground, neutralizing its power. It's like hitting delete on your worst dream, but with a shovel. The location of the burial might also be significant. Away from the home, perhaps near a boundary, a crossroads, or even a refuse heap. Places associated with spirits, transitions, or things to be discarded. Burying it might symbolically return the nightmare entity to the underworld, or simply distance its negative influence from the living space. It wasn't just hiding the evidence of a bad crafting day. It was a targeted act of banishment. Now let's look for our required element. A mainstream historical fact related to this kind of practice. The use of clay figurines and effigies in ancient ritual practices across the Near East and Egypt is well documented. These were used for various purposes, representing deities, ancestors, or even enemies to be cursed or controlled. For instance, in ancient Mesopotamia, incantation texts describe rituals. Maklu series is a famous one, involving the creation of effigies of witches or enemies out of clay, wax, or bitumen, which were then subjected to various torments, burning, breaking, drowning, to destroy the power of the person or spirit they represented. While not specifically nightmare dolls, this practice of using effigies for sympathetic magic and exorcism is a solid mainstream historical fact that provides context for how a nightmare-trapping ritual using a clay doll could fit into ancient worldviews. It wasn't a completely alien concept. It drew on established magical principles. Our quirky or fringe tidbit? How about the idea found in some interpretations related to ancient curse tablets or binding spells involving figures, that the mouth of the figure might be deliberately closed or sealed with wax or pitch? For a nightmare doll, this could be a specific step. After whispering the nightmare into the figure, you might seal its mouth to prevent the nightmare from escaping or speaking its terror back into the world. Imagine carefully smoothing a tiny bit of wax over the doll's pinched clay mouth. A small, strange, but deeply symbolic action. And an open scholarly debate? Historians still argue whether small, often crude, anthropomorphic, or sometimes monstrous clay figurines found in various archaeological contexts, like under doorsteps, in foundations, or buried near homes, were specific apotropaic items meant to ward off evil in general. Personal magical objects, like our theoretical nightmare dolls, or perhaps related to ancestor worship or fertility rites. Distinguishing between these uses is incredibly difficult without clear accompanying texts, which are often missing or ambiguous. So, were those little buried figures ancient nightmare action figures, doorstop guardians, or something else entirely? The debate is very much open. Let's continue with the hypothetical ritual. The disposal, burying, breaking, or burning, was likely the culmination. Some texts hinting at similar binding rituals mention destroying the effigy. Burning it, for instance, would dramatically and definitively end its existence, releasing the energy of the nightmare, hopefully in a harmless way, or destroying the contained entity. Breaking it would render it powerless. Burying it contains it, removes it from the living space. The chosen method would depend on the specific tradition and what was believed to be the most effective way to neutralize the particular kind of threat the nightmare represented. Maybe if the nightmare was about fire, you'd bury the doll. If it was about being trapped, you'd burn it. This ritual wasn't a one-time fix in the grand scheme of things. Ancient life was precarious, and challenges, spiritual included, were constant. You might have to perform this ritual every time a particularly disturbing nightmare occurred, or perhaps on a regular basis as a form of spiritual hygiene. It would be a small, personal act of resilience against the overwhelming forces of the night in the dream world. It connects you directly to the earth, to the source of the material, and gives you a physical action to perform against an invisible enemy. Think about the feeling of agency this would provide. Instead of lying there trembling after a terrifying dream, waiting for the next one, you are doing something. You are transforming fear into clay, vulnerability into action, and the intangible into something you can hold, manipulate, and ultimately discard. It's a powerful psychological tool, even if the underlying beliefs about spirits and dreams differ from ours. It gave people control in a world where they had very little. Forget your modern anxieties about work emails or awkward social interactions. Imagine your core anxiety being, will a demon steal my soul tonight? Suddenly pinching a bit of clay feels like a profoundly important task. And it's not just about the person having the dream. If dreams were omens for the family or community, or if the feared entity was a threat to more than just the dreamer, perhaps the ritual could be performed by a family member, or even a priest or priestess on behalf of the dreamer. This adds another layer of complexity and purpose. It becomes a communal or professionally administered form of spiritual protection. Our mainstream fact about Beru priests interpreting dreams? They might also have been the ones guiding or performing the rituals based on those interpretations. This whole process, from digging the clay to burying the doll, would be steeped in quiet focus and intention. It wasn't just arts and crafts, it was potent magic, the hushing of voices, the focus on the tactile sensation of the clay, the solemnity of the disposal. These sensory details would amplify the ritual's perceived effectiveness. It's the quiet scratching sound of fingernails on clay, the soft crumbling of earth as you cover the buried figure, the feeling of release when the act is complete, all designed to make the intangible threat feel real and its containment feel equally real and permanent. The lack of explicit, detailed instructions in surviving texts is a significant challenge for historians trying to piece this together. Hello, open scholarly debate. We have tantalizing fragments, mentions of effigies, discussions of dreams, rituals for banishing evil. Connecting them definitively to a widespread, standardized nightmare doll ritual is difficult. But the pieces are there, and the human need to confront and contain fear is universal. This hypothetical ritual, pieced together from hints and parallels, represents a deeply human response to a very ancient and persistent problem. How to find peace and safety when the lights go out and your mind takes you to terrifying places. And sometimes the answer involves getting your hands a little dirty. Hopefully, you wash them afterward. Clay can be surprisingly clingy. Okay, so you've gone through the ritual. You've woken from the nightmare, maybe shaken but resolute. You've gathered the clay, breathed your fear into it, shaped the terrifying presence into a physical form, whispered its name, sealed its theoretical mouth with theoretical wax if you were feeling particularly thorough, and had wax handy in 1500 BCE, and finally, you've performed the act of containment, whether that was wrapping it, burying it, or somehow sealing it away. You faced the intangible horror of the dream world and wrestled it into a lump of earth. You feel something, a sense of relief perhaps, a small victory against the night. But the question remains, what happens now? What is the life cycle of a nightmare trapped in clay? Does it just hang around forever? A little lumpy museum of your worst nights? Or is there a final act? The fate of these captured nightmares, or rather their clay prisons, likely depended on the specific tradition, the perceived power of the nightmare, and perhaps even the practicality of ancient housekeeping. Leaving a scary-looking clay doll lying around the house might not have been ideal, especially if you had small children who might decide it was a toy. Imagine little Timmy digging up Daddy's buried fear golem and having a grand old time playing fetch with it. So, disposal, or at least sequestering, was probably the norm. One of the most common methods suggested by archaeological finds, as we touched on, is burial. You dug a hole, put the doll in, and covered it up. Simple, effective, symbolic. Burying something places it out of sight, out of mind, and crucially, returns it to the earth. In many ancient beliefs, the earth is not just dirt. It's a primal substance, a source of life, and also a place of finality, associated with the underworld or the realm of the dead. Burying the nightmare doll might have been intended to send the contained entity back to wherever it was believed to originate from, or simply neutralize its power by returning it to a state of inert earth. It's the ultimate, go to your room and don't come out, but the room is 6 feet deep. The location of the burial matters too. Was it near the home, perhaps under the doorstep to act as a perpetual guardian, or warning to other nightmares? Was it at a boundary, like a city wall or a riverbank, places seen as liminal spaces where the veil between worlds was thin, ensuring the nightmare stayed on the other side? Or was it simply tossed onto the communal rubbish heap, literally treating the nightmare as waste, something vile and to be discarded? Each location would imbue the act with slightly different meaning: protection, banishment, or purification through removal. Another fate could have been destruction. Breaking the doll, perhaps crushing it or snapping its limbs, would be a symbolic act of destroying the power of the nightmare it contained. If the dream entity was perceived as particularly malevolent or persistent, simply burying it might not feel sufficient. You might need to ensure it could never reform or escape its clay prison. Smashing it to pieces, maybe against a rock, listening to the satisfying crunch of the dried clay, would provide a visceral sense of finality. It's like hitting uninstall on that piece of nightmare malware that's been messing with your sleep. Some traditions might have involved fire. Burning the doll, especially if it was made of dried clay, could be another powerful act of destruction and purification. Fire is a transformative element, capable of destroying physical forms and, in many belief systems, purifying or releasing spirits or energies. Watching the clay figure blacken and crumble in the flames, perhaps releasing a final wisp of symbolic smoke, could be seen as the ultimate exorcism of the nightmare. Plus, who doesn't love a good ritualistic bonfire after a bad night's sleep? Probably smells terrible though, like burning mud and residual fear. What about storing them? Could some dolls have been kept? Perhaps if they represented a specific, recurring nightmare that needed to be periodically checked upon, or maybe as a collection of conquered fears, a physical manifestation of overcoming adversity. Imagine a shelf in an ancient home lined with small, lumpy clay figures, each representing a past terror successfully contained. Oh yes, that one was the spider goat nightmare from last Tuesday, and the little chipped one over there, that was the time I dreamt my house was made of cheese. It's slightly less impressive than a trophy cabinet, but arguably more meaningful. However, the tendency for archaeological finds to be buried or broken suggests long-term storage wasn't the primary method of dealing with these objects. Cut to a mainstream historical fact that relates to the fate of such objects is the widespread practice of depositing items in specific locations as part of rituals or offerings across many ancient cultures. This includes burying objects under foundations for protection, like foundation deposits found in Mesopotamian temples and palaces. Depositing items in wells or rivers as offerings, like the famous La Tène site in Switzerland, where vast amounts of metalwork were deposited in a lake, or leaving items in tombs. While not always explicitly nightmare dolls, the act of ritually removing an object from the living space and placing it in a designated location, earth, water, or a special burial site, is a well-documented behavior connected to religious or magical beliefs. These deposited objects serve various purposes, from offerings to deities, commemoration of events, or, as in our case, perhaps the sequestering of negative forces. Could these dolls have been reused? Probably not in the sense of emptying out the nightmare and stuffing a new one in. Clay, once dried or fired, isn't easily reshaped, but perhaps the location or the ritual itself was reused. You might bury successive nightmare dolls in the same spot, creating a layered deposit of past terrors. Or the act of making and burying a doll became a standard response to any particularly bad dream. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit that might shed light on disposal. Some ancient magical texts or folk practices from later periods, but potentially drawing on older beliefs, mention specific disposal methods for objects used in binding spells or curses. This might involve burying the object at a crossroads, a place where multiple paths meet, symbolizing a point of transition or a place frequented by spirits or deities associated with travel and boundaries. Or sometimes, burying an object upside down or backward was seen as enhancing the binding or reversal effect, ensuring the contained entity or spell was disoriented and unable to return or act properly. So maybe you didn't just bury your nightmare doll, you buried it facing west, or standing on its head for that extra layer of magical security. Imagine meticulously positioning a tiny, lumpy figure upside down in a small hole before filling it in. Dedication to the craft of banishment. And of course, we need our phrase acknowledging the limits of our knowledge. Historians still argue whether many of the small, crude clay figures unearthed in residential areas or burial sites were personal magical items like these hypothetical nightmare dolls, mass-produced votive figures, or simply children's toys. Without written labels or clearer context for every find, differentiating between these possibilities is incredibly challenging. A figure found under a temple's foundation is likely a foundation deposit. A figure found in a tomb has a different probable meaning, but a generic, hand-sized clay person found near the hearth of a house, it could be anything. It could be a fertility charm, a protective spirit, a doll for a child, or the physical manifestation of someone's bad Tuesday night. The debate isn't just about function, it's about distinguishing between sacred, magical, domestic, and mundane uses in material culture. The act of disposal wasn't just about getting rid of the doll, it was the final critical step of the ritual. It was the period after the semicolon, completing the sentence of containment begun when you first dug the clay. By burying or destroying the figure, you were solidifying the boundary between the dream world and the waking world, between the power of the nightmare and your own safety. It was a physical manifestation of letting go of the fear, or at least putting it in a box and shipping it off to, well, somewhere else. Consider the psychological impact. The ritual itself provided agency, turning a passive experience of terror into an active one of creation and control. The disposal provided closure. You didn't just wait for the nightmare to fade, you actively participated in its demise or banishment. This tangible act would reinforce the feeling of security. You could walk past the spot where you buried the doll and think, my fear is there. It is contained. It cannot touch me now. It's like mentally locking the door to your bad dream, leaving the key with the earth. There might even have been follow-up rituals. Maybe a prayer offered over the burial site, a libation poured, or a simple act of acknowledging the completion of the work. Ancient rituals often involve multiple steps and gestures, ensuring the message reached the intended recipient, whether that was a deity, a protective spirit, or the banished nightmare entity itself. The decay of the clay doll itself over time would also mirror the hoped-for fate of the nightmare. Clay buried in damp earth will slowly soften and return to mud, eventually becoming indistinguishable from the surrounding soil. This natural process could be seen as the ultimate dissolution of the nightmare's form and power. The earth reclaims everything, including captured fears. It's a strangely comforting thought that even the scariest things eventually just become dirt again. Unless it was fired clay, in which case you've just left a little terracotta demon underground forever. Hope you buried it deep. This aspect of the ritual, the final disposition, highlights the transient nature of magical objects in many ancient practices. They weren't always meant to last forever. They were tools for a specific purpose, and once that purpose was served, their power might be considered expended, or they might even become dangerous if not properly handled or disposed of. A nightmare successfully trapped is a good thing. An old, forgotten nightmare doll, accidentally unearthed or broken, could potentially release the contained fear back into the world. This is where those stories of ancient curses being unleashed by disturbing old sites might originate. A folk interpretation of what happens when you mess with things that were deliberately put away. So the life of a clay nightmare doll was likely short and purposeful. Born from fear and earth, given form by intention, filled with terror, contained, and then returned to the earth or destroyed, its brief existence was dedicated to a single goal: protecting your sleep and sanity from the things that lurked in the darkness of your mind. It's a profound thought that something so seemingly simple, a lump of mud shaped by hand, could be a frontline defense against spiritual and psychological threats in the ancient world. And maybe, just maybe, if you find a strange, small clay figure buried in your garden someday, you should think twice before bringing it inside. Just saying, better safe than sorry when it comes to ancient fear containment. So, you've dealt with the nightmare, shaped it, contained it, and disposed of its physical form. It's gone, hopefully forever, returned to the earth or scattered to the winds. But while the specific clay lump might have vanished from the world, the idea of it, well, ideas have a way of sticking around, don't they? The legacy of these ancient rituals to trap nightmares isn't always found neatly labeled in a museum display case, though sometimes if you squint at certain artifacts, you might catch a glimpse. It's more often found in the echoes, the persistence of certain concepts in folklore, in later magical traditions, and even in the way we subconsciously try to deal with our anxieties today. Archaeology gives us fragments, those small, often crude, anthropomorphic or zoomorphic figures found in domestic contexts, burials, or ritual deposits. Some of them, as we've discussed, could potentially be these nightmare figures or similar objects used for protection or binding. Finding them helps paint a picture, albeit a blurry one, of the material culture of fear management in the ancient world. You see these little lumps of clay, maybe just a few inches tall, and you wonder what they meant to the person who shaped them. Was it a child's toy, a representation of a ginan, or a physical cage for something terrifying? The context is key, but often ambiguous. A figure buried under a threshold is a strong candidate for proactive magic, potentially including warding off bad dreams or the entities causing them. A figure clutched in the hand of a buried person might have been a comfort or a charm carried into the afterlife. And figures simply broken and discarded might have served their purpose and been tossed aside, their power neutralized or simply no longer needed. The concept of physically externalizing something internal and negative is incredibly powerful, and it didn't die out with the Bronze Age. You see it in later magical practices throughout the world. creating effigies of enemies to curse them, or sometimes to heal them by transferring illness, making puppets or dolls for protective magic, tying knots to bind spells or spirits. The specific materials and rituals change, but the underlying principle remains. Take something abstract, give it a physical form, and then manipulate that form to achieve a desired outcome. The clay nightmare doll is a potent early example of this widespread human tendency to interact with the intangible through the tangible. It's like turning your emotional baggage into carry-on luggage you can actually check. Think about talismans and amulets, small objects carried for protection or good luck. Many ancient and modern examples are designed to ward off evil spirits, the evil eye, or misfortune, all of which could be linked to causing distress and bad dreams. Wearing a protective pendant might be the evolution of bearing a protective figure. Instead of locking the badness away from your home, you're creating a personal shield you carry with you. The materials change, clay to metal, stone, or wood, but the intent to use a physical object to manipulate unseen forces is remarkably consistent. It's a mainstream historical fact, illustrating this persistence of using objects to externalize or contain abstract concepts can be seen in medieval and early modern European folk magic practices. Charms against specific ailments or fears often involved writing down prayers or magical phrases on scraps of parchment, folding them up and wearing them in a pouch around the neck. Illness or distress was seen as an external force or entity, and the written charm, much like the clay doll, became a physical vessel for counter magic, a way to bind or repel the negative influence. Sometimes even more direct parallels exist, like the concept of worry knots or objects specifically designed to absorb or ward off nightmares, though their exact lineage back to ancient clay dolls is hard to trace definitively. The idea echoes into folklore and mythology too. Tales of spirits or demons being trapped in bottles, boxes, or other containers abound across cultures. Jinn in lamps, ghosts in lockets, evil entities confined to specific locations by powerful magic. These narratives reflect the enduring human desire to believe that the formless can be given form and the dangerous can be contained. The ancient person shaping clay to trap their nightmare is performing a micro version of the epic hero tricking a demon into a flask. Same principle, different scale and production value. And it's not just historical or mythical. Look at modern psychological coping mechanisms. Journaling about your fears, writing them down on paper. Isn't that a form of externalizing them? Giving them a concrete form outside of your swirling thoughts? Squishing a stress ball, fidgeting with a worry stone. These are physical actions taken to manage internal anxiety or discomfort. The very act of talking about a fear, articulating it, can lessen its power, much like whispering the nightmare's name into the clay, acknowledged and defined the threat. There's a real psychological parallel here. Bringing something from the chaotic, overwhelming internal world into the structured, manageable external world provides a sense of control. The therapy technique of externalizing problems, seeing anxiety or depression not as inherent flaws but as external entities that can be fought or managed, resonates strongly with the ancient practice of giving a nightmare a physical body. By making the nightmare a thing, it becomes something you can do something about, rather than just an amorphous terror that possesses you. You can shape it, name it, fight it, and ultimately get rid of it. It's ancient cognitive behavioral therapy, potentially less effective, but with cooler props. A quirky or fringe tidbit that touches on this legacy can be found in the tradition of Guatemalan worry dolls, muñecas quitapenas. These tiny, colorful dolls are traditionally told your worries before being placed under your pillow at night. The belief is that the dolls will then worry for you, allowing you to sleep peacefully. While this is a much more recent tradition, becoming widespread in the 20th century, and serves a slightly different purpose, taking on worries rather than trapping nightmares, the core concept of transferring internal distress to a small, physical object for containment and relief shares a fascinating resonance with the ancient clay figures. They are, in a way, the gentle, colorful descendants of the lumpy, fear-filled dolls of the past. And this brings us back to the limits of our knowledge. Historians still argue whether many of the small, unidentifiable clay figures found in ancient domestic contexts were primarily intended for practical magic, like nightmare binding, devotional purposes, like representing household spirits, or simply served as mundane objects like toys or teaching aids. The lack of explicit textual evidence directly describing nightmare dolls' rituals in many cultures means we are often interpreting ambiguous archaeological finds through the lens of later magical traditions, or by drawing parallels to similar practices elsewhere. Was every little human-shaped lump of clay a battle won against the night? Probably not. But were some of them? It's a compelling possibility that fits the patterns of human behavior across time. The power of these ancient rituals and their lingering echoes lies in their ability to give form and agency to the terrifying formlessness of nightmares. They allowed people, armed with little more than mud and intention, to push back against the darkness that haunted their sleep. They transformed passive dread into active creation and destruction. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, finding ways, however simple, to feel safe in a world filled with seen and unseen dangers. Looking back at this long journey, tracing the possible path from a terrifying dream to a lump of clay in the ground, you can appreciate the ingenuity and the deep human need for control in the face of the unknown. You've explored the depths of ancient fears, the simple materials used to combat them, and the persistent threads of these ideas woven through history and even into our modern lives. And now, as the story winds down and the images of ancient homes, flickering lamps, and small clay figures begin to fade, now dim the lights a little more. Let the soft hum of the fan or the gentle silence of your space settle around you. You've traveled a long way tonight, back through millennia, exploring the quiet corners of ancient lives and their struggles with the unseen world that emerges when the lights go out. Let go of the details now. The specific shapes of the dolls, the names of the ancient cultures, the debates among scholars. Let them drift away like smoke. Focus instead on the feeling of quietness, the sense of history settling softly around you. The knowledge that people, just like you, for thousands of years, have sought comfort and control in the face of the night. You are safe here. The nightmares are confined to the realm of sleep, and even there, they are just fleeting images. Take a deep, slow breath. Feel your body relax. The worries of the day, like the terrors of ancient dreams, can be acknowledged and then released. Let the sounds around you become a lullaby. The gentle rhythm of your own breathing, the soft settling of the house, the distant sounds of the night outside your window. They are all part of the world, a world that is quiet and calm now. Drift with these sounds. Feel the weight of sleep pulling gently at your eyelids. The story is over. The journey is complete. There is nothing left to do but rest. Let your mind become still, peaceful, and empty. Allow yourself to sink into the quiet darkness, ready for dreams that are gentle, or simply no dreams at all. You are secure. You are at peace. Sleep awaits.